What's going on, guys? Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Amigoscode. In this course, you will learn about Spring Boot and Angular full stack web development. For this course, Junior will be your instructor, so we decided to collaborate, and I feel like the way Junior teaches is kind of similar to the way I teach, so that's why I decided to have him on the channel. In this course, you will learn full stack web development by building the backend with Spring Boot and then the front end with Angular and connect everything together. Junior has a YouTube channel called Get Raise. Go ahead and subscribe to his channel, show some love because he deserves it. If you're new to my channel, go ahead and subscribe, give me a thumbs up. Also, if you're not part of the Amigoscode community, go ahead and join. Both Junior and I and the entire community will be there to answer the questions that you might have throughout this course. This is all from me, and now I'm going to let Junior take over. Catch you later.
Welcome to the first videos in this series where I'm going to show you how to build a Spring Boot API or Spring Boot backend application along with an Angular application that's going to be communicating with that backend. And at the end of this course, you're going to build this application that you're looking at on your screen. And this is a simple employee manager application where you can manage employee. At the top, you have the name of the application, so employee manager, and then you have this add employee, which is a button. So if I click on add employee, I have this nice form where I can enter a new employee information and then save my changes. So I entered this new guy here, and then now I'm going to click on save changes. Now you can see if I remove the last image URL here and the input in the form, you can see now I can't click this button anymore. The button is disabled. That's because we have validation on this form. I'm going to go ahead and put that address in here, and then I'm going to click save. As you can see, now we have John Hutchins in here. And of course, to the far right, we can search. So if I go in there and I type Rick, as you can see, everyone that has Rick in their name is there. And if I put a K here, not only Rick Robinson is on this list. So another thing you can do here is you can edit the employee's information. So let's say Scarlett got married, she changed her last name and we want to update her last name. So I can click on this edit icon here, which is a button, and then I can go here. Let's say the last name is now, I don't know, Smith, and we can just save. Now you can see the last name is Smith. And of course we can delete an employee. So let's say we want to remove someone from the list. We can just click on this X right here. Once we click on this, it's going to give us this validation message. And this is like a safe way to make sure you're deleting the user. If you are making a mistake, you can just click no, or you can just close this window. Otherwise, you can proceed and then you click yes. As you can see now, Ocean is gone. And this is a very simple application. I just made it up just so I can use it as an example for what we're going to be building. This could be anything. It could be users, it could be students, and of course, we can add way much more functionalities to it. But that's just a simple example, and that example is good enough for you to have a very good understanding, of how you can create an API with Spring Boot and then use any front-end application for that matter to actually communicate with the backend. So grab your coffee or tea or whatever else you're drinking. We have a lot to cover, and I'll see you in the next lecture.
Before you kick off this course, I just want to tell you that if you want to gain the most out of this course, make sure to practice, because Junior, he has tons of experience building backend applications as well as front-end applications, and he's actually a full stack developer. He has lots to teach you, and the way that you're going to gain the most out of this course is to practice as Junior teaches. That's the best way, really. So we want to add value by giving you really awesome content, but you also have to do your part, which is to practice. If you have any questions, as I said, go ahead and join the private Facebook group as well as Discord, where Junior and I and the entire community, over 12,000 people, will be there to answer your questions. The community is so engaging, lots of people asking questions, helping other people. So I would love to have you there. This is all for now. Let's kick off this course.
I wanted to go over some of the prerequisites you need to have so that you can follow along. So this is going to be a Spring Boot backend application, and the whole Spring environment is primarily based on Java. So it's very important that you understand Java in Java Spring or Spring and Spring Boot. So right off the bat, you need to understand those two technologies because we're going to use the programming language Java with Spring and Spring Boot to build the entire backend. So you need to have some good understanding of those technologies. And then we have front-end technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So since we're going to be building a front-end application, you need to be familiar with things like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, you don't need to know JavaScript like an expert, but you need to have some basic concepts of JavaScript and how it works. And then we have Angular with TypeScript. Now, Angular uses TypeScript, and TypeScript is really just a superset of JavaScript. It helps write better JavaScript code. And Angular, which is a JavaScript framework, it uses TypeScript. So we're going to be writing the majority of our code for Angular in TypeScript. So it makes sense that you understand what TypeScript is and how it uses. And then we have HTTP. HTTP, I'm just expecting you to understand the basic concepts of HTTP, like requests and response, headers, so that you're not super confused when the front end is communicating with the back end, because that communication is going to be done over HTTP, which is like the whole thing with API, because you can call them over the internet. And then we have the command line interface. Now, the reason this is on here, it's because I'm going to use an HTTP client, and that HTTP client is called HTTP Pi. It's really nice when you need an HTTP client to call the backend or make a call to the backend. I'm also going to be using Postman, but I want to show you how you can, achieve the same goals that you can achieve in Postman with HTTP Pi, which is like curl, which is like a command line program that you can use to make HTTP requests. And then understanding of databases. Now, you don't need to be an expert at SQL or anything like that. I just need you to understand the basic concepts of what a database is, and it's used to store data and things like that, because we're going to have a very simple configuration in our application so that we can connect to a MySQL database. So that's pretty much it. Like, you don't really have to be an expert in any of those technologies at all. I just want to make sure that you're aware of what to expect. So make sure you have some basic understandings of those technologies. I want to show you where you can go to get some of those things that you need to know, and some of the environment setup that you need to do. So right here, I am at java.com, and that's where you go to download Java. So if you don't have the Java Development Kit or the JJK, you can just come here and then click on this button here to download it, and then go through the steps. Now, there are many resources online that you can use to, they will teach you how to download and install Java. So I'm not going to be doing that in this lecture, but you should definitely, Google it and find some resource on the internet, and they will show you how to do this properly, like set it up and everything. So that's Java. And then Node.js. Now, we don't necessarily need Node.js. Our backend is not going to be built with Node. It's going to be built with Spring Boot. But the reason we need Node.js here is because we're going to use the npm package manager to install the Angular CLI, which we're going to be using to build our Angular application. So you can just click on this green button here or get whatever version you want. Doesn't really matter. And then once you have the Node.js package installed, then you will have access to npm, which is Node Package Manager, which is like a command that you can use to download and install stuff. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing so that we can install the Angular CLI here. So as you can see, we just say npm, which is Node Package Manager, you're going to get from installing Node.js. And then you can just install the Angular CLI globally on your computer. Now, you don't need to run those other three commands because we're not going to be building the front end first. We're going to be building the back end first. So you just need to run that one command, the first one, and then you should be good to go. Now, for my IDE for Java, I'm going to be using IntelliJ. And as you can see here, here's IntelliJ. You can get the community version if you don't want to pay for it. I have a paid version, but you don't necessarily have to have a paid version. You can just get the free version, or you can use any other IDE, Java IDE, or whatever text editor you want. It doesn't really matter. I'm just showing you guys what I'm going to be using. So I'm going to be using IntelliJ, and you can just click on download here to download it. And that's what I'm going to be using for the backend. And then I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code for the front end. As you can see here, Visual Studio Code is like a very nice text editor. It's super powerful and very popular these days. So I'm going to be using it to build the actual front end. And then as our HTTP clients, I'm going to be using Postman. Postman also very popular, but you can use Insomnia or any other client library that you want. But I'm going to be using Postman with HTTP PI though, because I want to show you how you can actually make requests using HTTP PI, or if you want, you can just use curl. You don't necessarily have to install HTTP PI just for this, but I'm just going to show you how it's such a nice, very nice command that you can use with HTTP PI to make HTTP requests. That's pretty much everything you need to have configured on your computer. And if you're already a developer or whatever configuration you already have and you like it, you don't need to do any of these things. Like, you don't need to download any things I just talked about here. You can just stick to what you like. In the next lecture, we're just gonna dive into coding. So I'll see you guys. What you're looking at right now on your screen is the Spring Initializer website. And this website, you can use it to just bootstrap any Spring Boot application. So if you go to start.spring.io, you will land on that website. And all we have to do is to just, specify the information that we want for our project. And then we can just click on generate at the bottom. So here you can see this is a Maven project, so I'm gonna keep this selected. You can do a Gradle project if you want. It's just a different build tool, but at the end of the day, it's gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna be using Java as a programming language. Spring Boot 2.31 is fine with me, so I'm gonna keep all of this default here. So in the group ID, I'm gonna do tech.get arrays. So this is usually like the domain of the organization reversed. So you can see, like, usually it's com, but my domain is tech, so it would be like com dot and then the actual domain. So I'm gonna do tech.get arrays, and that's what you usually have here as your group ID. And then artifact ID, I'm just gonna give the name, so employee manager, which is gonna be the same for the name of the application. And then here I'm just gonna say employee manager app, and I want this to be, well, yeah, that looks right. So the package, you can change that as well, but I'm just gonna keep whatever is generated for me. And our package is gonna be a jar, which means whenever we package the application to be deployed, it's gonna be a Java archive file, which is what the jar is. And then we're gonna do Java 8 version. So you can do Java 11 or Java 14, it doesn't really matter. Just don't do anything below 8. Now let's look at some of the dependency that we can get. So here, this is gonna be a web application, so I need the web dependency. So I'm gonna click on add dependencies, and I'm just gonna type web, and you have Spring Web come up. Another dependency that I need is the dependency for the JPA repository. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. And that's just Java Persistence API. So we need to have a way to map like class. So we're going to be mapping this employee class to a database. So let's do JPA, and that's going to bring us Spring Data JPA. And we need a way to connect to the database, and we need a MySQL connector, which is going to be another dependency. So I'm going to do MySQL. And that's going to bring us the driver that we need to connect to a MySQL database. You can add more dependencies as you want. You can click on Explore right here just to see what the POM file is going to look like. So you can see all the information is entered in here, and here's our version. We have the JPA here, web, and then MySQL connector here, just so we can connect to the database. So you see what you're gonna get whenever you download the file, and you can see all the plugins and stuff. This is just coming in by default. So I'm gonna close that, and then at this point we're ready to generate the application. So I'm just gonna click on this button and then generate the application. And as you can see here, it's being downloaded as a zip file, and it's already downloaded. So I'm gonna go ahead and unzip this, and then I'm gonna open it in the IDE. Right now I'm in my Windows Explorer, as you can see in my download inside the Employee Manager, which I unzipped earlier. And now I have all the files that were generated for me. So I'm just gonna double click on this pom.xml file, and that's gonna open the application with IntelliJ, as you can see here. So here's the application. Gonna close this real quick, and let's expand this to see what we have. You can see the all of our package name, and here's the main application class. So I'm going to double click on that. As you can see, it's a simple Spring Boot application that we have here. So the first thing I want to do is to create our model class. So I'm going to go over to the main package. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to create a new package. So I'm going to go down here, package, and let's just call this model, or we can call it domain as well. Usually it's domain or model. This is where you keep all your model classes. So here I'm gonna go ahead and create a new class, and I'm gonna call it employee. So this is gonna represent the employee in the application that we're going to be managing. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give him an ID. So I'm going to do private, and that's going to be of type long, and I'm just going to do ID. And then I want to give him a name. So let's do private. That's going to be a string. That's going to be name. Then I want to give him an email. So I'm going to do another string. Email, and I want to give them a job title, so that's going to be private, another string, and let's just call this job title. So that's going to be like whatever they are, like database developer or UX developer or Java developer or Python developer or JavaScript developer. And then let's get their phone number. And again, this is just me making this up, so this is something that's going to come from the requirements of the application that you're building. That's not something you're going to just be thinking off the top of your head. So, and let's give them an image. That's going to be image URL. So this image can also be like an actual file, like a Java file like this. But we're not going to be doing that because that's not the best way to save images, even though at the end of the day, the image is going to be stored on the server, right? But usually in applications like this, you want to point to the location of the actual picture. And this is what this is going to be doing. So this is going to hold the location where we can read this file and then show it to the user. And let's give him some random code. Like let's say every employee has like some random code. So let's do string employee code, and I just made that up. You can think of any kind of scenario that you want. So this is everything that an employee is gonna have, and again, this is really up to you or up to whatever application you're building. That I just made this up. So another thing I want to do is to implement serializable, and I'm gonna tell you why I'm doing this. So serializable from java.io. So the serializable, it helps transform this Java class into different types of stream, because this class is going to be saved in a database and then it's going to be sent to the front end as JSON. So it's always best to make classes that are going to be in different types of stream, implement the serializable, because it helps with this whole process. Now what I want to do is to map this class to a database, right? So I want this class to be a table in some database, and I can give it any name I want. By default, it's going to be employee, but the point is I want this class to be in a database so that I can update and delete and do whatever operation that I need to do. And this is why we brought in the JPA repository, because it's going to allow us to do this. So let's go over on top, and I'm going to do add entity, and this is going to make sure that this class is mapped to any database that we have configured on the class path. And I need also to give this a primary key, which is going to be the primary key in the database, and that's why I'm using this ID here. And to do this, you just have to do add ID, and make sure you're bringing everything from Java X persistence. And also we need to tell it how to generate this information. So I'm just going to do add generated value, and here we just need to pass in the strategy. So I'm going to do, we could also leave it like this, it would still work, but if you want to be specific, we can just do strategy equals generation type, and we can make this auto or identity. So I'm just going to do identity in this case. You can look those up because it's a few of them, but you can look them up, what they mean actually, like what is happening when you select one. But any one of them, in this case, will do the trick for us, because we're not really concerned about performance and database and all that stuff. We just need to have this saved in a database right now, so we don't need to carry much. We could just do auto or whatever, it would still work. And then another thing I want to specify here, actually you can specify a lot of annotation on this ID to configure it, but there's one that I want to show you. So if I do add column, I can specify some column information, right? So let's say I don't want this to be updated. Like once it's set forever. So I can do nullable, and I can set this to false. And I can also do updatable and set this to false. Okay, so that way once this is set, it can never be updated in our database. And we can do the same for the employee code, assuming that the employee code is like some secret thing in our company, and only one employee can have one at a time, and it shouldn't be updated. Like we treat it as an ID, but I'm just making it up here just for the sake of an actual scenario. So now that we have this class, there's another library called Lombok. We could just use Lombok to generate getters and setters, and constructors, but I'm just gonna do it by hand because I didn't want to bring a Lombard into this. So I'm gonna generate constructors, default constructor, and then getters and setters for this class. So I went ahead and generated getters and setters. As you can see, we have all of the information here. We have our default constructor, constructor with parameters, and we have all of our getters and setters. And then at the bottom, I have this toString method in case that I want to print this out so that I can see a nice printout and not the location of the object. So that's what we have to do for the actual employee. In the next lecture, we're going to wire up the database connectivity, and then we're going to start the application and see if we can map this actual class in the database as a table. So I have my SQL installed on my computer. So if I do my SQL, and as you can see here, I have the command line here. I'm going to open this real quick and bring it over. So you can see if I put in my password, and now I see I'm connected to the MySQL server, as you can see here. So I can do like show databases, and you guys don't need to know this. I'm just showing you that I have MySQL on my computer, which is what I'm going to be connecting to using this application. So make sure you have some sort of a database on your computer that's already installed that you can use. So I'm going to close out of this, and let's go into the properties, application.properties file. And here, I'm going to put a quick comment. So I'm going to do my SQL configuration. And in here, I want to specify the location of the database, the username, and the password at a minimal. So I'm going to do spring.data source, and I want the URL. And this is going to be jdbc : MySQL and : // and then the actual location. So in my case, since it's on my computer, so I'm going to localhost, and the port is 3306, and I just have to specify the name of the database. So I'm gonna do create a database. So I'm gonna call it employee manager. So, okay, so this is the name of the database here, which I haven't created yet, but that's gonna be the actual database where the table is going to be created for this class right here. So we're going to have a table in that database that's going to be called employee with all of those rows in it. So let's go back to the application. So we need to specify the username and the password. So I'm going to copy this and go here, and I want to do the username, and in my case it's root. Now you would usually use root as the actual username. You would actually have a specific user with specific permission that you set up for different applications. But this is on my local, and I'm just showing you an example. So I can use root here to access my database. And then the password, and that's going to be let me in. Again, you can see this. I can type it out like this, like in this application.properties file, because it's on my local. Like this is going to reside on my local computer. Now, if I were to deploy this application anytime in this application, oops, I have a typo here. I got to fix it. Configuration. So if you were to deploy this application, you would probably not have those string like this all open, because that's a security vulnerability. So you would probably have like some secure way of accessing some remote server and then get those username and password to be used in this application. Or maybe you would like encrypt them in a file and then decrypt them when you need to use them, etc. So point is, you would never have this like this open because that's not very secure. Okay, and then I want to specify some other stuff. Let's do spring.jpa. I want to do show SQL, and I'm going to set this to true so that we can see the SQL queries being shown in the console whenever JPA is executing queries and stuff. And it's just a nice thing to see whenever you're working with Spring Boot, so that you can see, oh, okay, so my JPA is actually updating this data, etc. Something else we have to specify is the data description language. And I'm going to tell you what this is in a second. So let's do spring.jpa.hibernate, and we wanted to sell the DDL. And this stands for data description, and it's just going to tell the application how to in some way manage the database. So if you set it to create, then every time you run the application, it's going to drop all the tables and then create them again. But if you set it to update, it's only going to do that once. So it's going to create the database and everything if they weren't already created, and then it's going to just update the data, which is what we want. We don't want to recreate create everything every time. Otherwise, we will be losing all of our data. And then the last thing we have to do, at least at a minimal, we have to specify the dialect. So let's do spring.jpa.properties.hibernate.dialect. And we need to set this to the actual dialect that we're using. I'm using MySQL, I think 5, so we have to set it to the MySQL 5 dialect. So let's do org.hibernate.dialect. And here we have to just say MySQL dialect MySQL 5, just like that. So this is at a minimal the configuration we need to put in for our data source. And at this point now we can run the application and see what happens. So I don't know what's going to happen yet, so let's go ahead and give it a try. So I'm going to go into the main application class, which is this class right here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and click on this green arrow here and then click on run. And we're going to let this come up. Okay, it's coming up. Let's see what we have. Okay, so it started and we got an error and it says database employee manager is unknown. So the app runs fine, but we don't have that actual employee manager database created. So we can actually create that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this name and go here and type MySQL. And I'm going to start the command line interface for MySQL, put in my password. And here I'm just going to say create database. And I'm just going to pass in the name of the database and then click enter. And now if you want it again, I'm just going to click on this rerun here and let it come up. Okay, so everything runs fine. You can see it creates the table and it inserted all the rows in it. And you can check here. It says the application is running on port 8080. So I'll see you guys in the next one. So in the last lecture, we created our application. We actually set up a database connectivity, which we did here. So now what I want to do is I want to have a way to save an employee, right? So let's say, I'm using the application as a front-end user and I need to save an employee, right? So we need to have a mechanism to do that, which is why we brought in the JPA repository. So we're going to be actually using it so that we can do those operations on our database. So we can actually do all of this with Java, like we can write our own repository so that we can save employee and everything. But this is something that is so repetitive that it was created and then optimized for us. So we're just going to make use of those libraries that we brought in instead of having to do this ourselves. So I'm going to go here under the main package and I'm going to create a new package and I'm going to call it repo, short for repository. And then here I'm going to create an interface. And let's go here and I'm just going to do Java class, and you have to select class and then here you can select interface. So here I'm just going to call it employee repo and I'm going to click enter. So now we have this interface employee repo here. What we can do here is we can extend the JPA repository. So we can do JPA repository. And then here we have to pass in some information. So for the JPA repository, we have to tell it what class this repository is for. So that's going to be employee, coming from our domain, as you can see here in our model. And then you have to pass in the type of the primary key. So let's do long. So if you remember, if we go back into the employee class, this is the primary key that we created. And it needs to know the type, which is along here, which is what I'm specifying here. So once we have this, we have access to all of those. So I'm going to go back real quick. I did it too fast. So if I hold control, at least in IntelliJ, and then click on this, it's going to take me to this class that I'm extending. And you can see we have access to all of those methods here or functions. So we can save, delete batch, and find all, which is going to give us a list of all the employees that we have in our database and everything. So we're going to make use of all of those, and we didn't even have to write them. So that's the whole point of having JPA repository or Spring Data in your application and to some sort. So that's the advantage of using the JPA repository. So now we can just inject this anytime we want to save an employee, and then we can call one of those methods here. As you can see, we have a save all. We can pass in an iterable. So we didn't have to write all of those ourselves. Let's go ahead and see if we can use this now in our class. In the same base package, I'm going to create another package and I'm going to call it service. And this is going to represent the service class that we're going to use in our controller. And this is all going to make sense in a minute. So here I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call it employee service, right? Because that's what it is. So now what I want to do in this service is to bring in that repository that I just created. So let's do private final, and let's call this the employee repo. And that's going to be of type employee repo. So now we have that repository here, and we're going to inject it in this class so that we can use it in this class. So I'm just going to over it, and it's going to give me this option here, and I just pass it in this class as a constructor. So whenever this service is constructed, it will have this employee repo inside of it so that we can do whatever we want to do. And of course, we need to annotate this with that service from Spring Framework. And the last thing we want to do is to add AutoWire on this here so that we can bring in this dependency. So at this point, we can use this repository to do all of our CRUD operations. So let's go down here, and I'm going to create another method. I'm going to call it, let's say I need a method to add employee, right? So let's do employee add employee. This method is going to take an employee. So let's do employee, and then here what I want to do is to create this employee in the actual database. But before I do that, I want to generate the actual employee code, because I'm not going to ask the users to give me this employee code. So let me make some more room here. All right, so here what I want to do is to create this actual code. So I'm going to call on the employee, and I'm going to say set employee code, which is a string. And then here I can just pass in some random UID here. And I can just say random ID, and I can just convert this to a string. Okay, so now this employee will have this random UUID, and then at this point I can just save this actual employee. So here I can just say return employee repository, and I can just call the save method on that. As you can see here, there's a save method. I can just pass in this employee here. Okay, so that way we can save that employee. So you can see how we're using this repository here to do those operations for us. And if you really drill into the actual repository and JPA repository, you will see that it's doing all the JDBC query, creating queries and all this stuff for us. So we don't have to do it manually. We can do it manually. There's instances where you actually have to do it manually because your data is so complex. But in our case, we're not dealing with any complex data. So we can, greatly make use of JPA repository. So we're going to continue adding the other functions or methods that we need for our CRUD operation. And then after that, we'll be able to create our controller and then start seeing this in action. Let's go down a few lines and let's do public. And I need another method so that I can return a list of all of the employees. So this is going to return a list of employee. And I'm going to call this find all employees. And it's not going to take any parameters because it's just returning the list or all the users that we have in the database. And then here I can just return the repository, and I call find all on that repository. And let's scroll down a little bit more. And here, let's say I need another one to update the employee. So I'm going to do public employee and update employee. And this is going to take the employee. And what I want to do is to just save that employee. That's save, and I can just pass in that employee. Now I need another function. I need two other functions. There's one to delete an employee. So let's do this one real quick. So public delete employee, and this is going to return void. So void, and what I want to pass into this is to pass in the actual ID of the employee. So we're going to do long ID, and then in here we can just call the delete. So I'm just going to do employee delete, and I pass in the ID in here. So you can see I'm getting an error because the employee repo doesn't have a delete by default. So I'm going to create a new method. So I'm going to call it delete employee by ID, and I'm going to go ahead and create this method. So create method, and as you can see, here's this method. And because we named this delete employee by ID when then we pass in the actual ID, Spring is able to understand this language and then create the query for us to delete an employee by ID. And this is what you would call a query method because of the naming convention. So as you can see, there's delete employee, which is the class name, by ID, which is a field. And what Spring is going to do is to create a query to delete employee where ID equals this ID we're passing in here. So this is a whole different discussion, and I don't want to get into it right now, but that's exactly what this is doing. So now we shouldn't have any problem if we go back to our service. Spring understands that what we're trying to do here is to delete this employee by passing in this ID here. And I'm going to do another example just so you guys can understand. So let's do an example where I want to find an employee by the ID. So I'm going to do public, and let's make sure this returns an employee, and let's call it find employee by ID. And here we can pass in the actual ID just like that. And then what I want to do is call the employee repository. So this is going to return the employee that they find. So I'm going to do return employee repo, and then I do find employee by ID. Okay, and then I pass in the actual ID in here. As you can see, this method doesn't exist, but Spring is able to understand it. So now I'm going to create it in here, and because we have find, it's going to do a select employee. So it's going to say, okay, so an employee from that table by ID, where ID equals this ID we're passing in here. So this is called query method in Spring. So now if we go back, you can see that we don't have this error anymore. But now there's another thing I want to do. Instead of having this return an employee, I'm going to make it return an optional, because there is a situation where I might not have that employee. So let's say they pass in some random ID and there's not an employee by that ID. So let's make sure this return an optional. And let's go back to the actual service. And now you can see we have an error because this is returning an optional. So what we can do to fix this problem is we can make use of Java 8 and then do something else in case we can't find an actual employee. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to do dot or else throw. Okay, so here I'm going to pass in an exception supply. So I'm saying, hey, try to find an employee. So all of this. So if we find an employee by this ID, this is going to return the code will not execute whatever comes after this. However, if we don't find an employee by that ID, then we can throw whatever exception here. So what I'm going to do here is to pass in the actual exception. So I'm going to do equal, and in here I can pass in some new exception. So let's say new user not found exception, and then we can pass in some random message in here. So we can say something like user by ID, and then we pass in the ID, and we can say was not found. Okay, I'm gonna put all of this on a new line just so you can see it. And of course we don't have this exception yet, and I'm gonna show you how we can create this exception so that we can throw it every time we try to find an employee and we don't have an employee by that ID in our database. So in the last lecture, we created our service and we added all the methods that we need to use in our application. So add a new employee, find all the employees, update an employee, and then find an employee by ID, and then delete an employee. So we're pretty much done with the service. It's a very simple service, not really complicated, but we do have to fix this exception right here, which is where we try to find an employee by an ID. And if we can't find this employee in the application or in the database, we're just gonna throw this user not found exception. Obviously, I just made this up on the fly as I was typing. This exception doesn't exist yet. So let's go ahead and create that exception so that we can get rid of this error. So here, I'm just gonna hover it and go to more actions, and then create class user not found exception. And I'm gonna put it in a different package. You can see it's gonna put it in the same package of that class that we're on. So here I'm gonna just put it in a different package called exception. So now we have this new package created and the class is in here. So since this is an exception, I can just extend the runtime exception. So I'm gonna do runtime exception, and here I can just call the super class. So I know I'm gonna get a message. So I'm gonna do message, and inside here I can just call the constructor for that message from the super class. So I can just do super and then pass in my message here. So what this is gonna do is gonna call the constructor on that class and then pass in this message. There's a constructor where you can pass in a message. So as you can see, we're passing in this message here, this whole string here, which is the message that we're passing. So that message is gonna get passed down to this exception right here. And we're getting an error here, and that's because we didn't specify that this is gonna return an optional of employee. So we're gonna do employee, and that should fix the problem. Go back. Now, as you can see, it's gone. So that's everything we have to do for our employee service. And at this point, we're ready to use the service and then start making transactions in our database. So I'll see you guys in the next one. I wanted to step back and then take a look at the design of this little application that we're building. So right now we've already worked on the service and the data layer. So now we're ready to have a controller that can access the service and then respond to requests coming in from any client. That can be like the browser, it can be Postman or any HTTP client, it can be curl or anything like that. So those requests are gonna come in and they're gonna come through the controller. You shouldn't really put any real logic in the controller. You just have to accept requests and then send responses back to the caller. So the controller, it's supposed to just be very small, very simple, and it's just taking those requests and then pass them down over to the service. And then in the service, along with other like utility classes you would have that you can call inside of that service, you would do all of your logic and then access the data from the service as well. At this point, we're done with the service. We have our data layer connected, and now we're just gonna go ahead and work on the controller. So the controller is gonna be receiving all of the requests coming in and sending all the response. And this is the part of the backend or the server that is going to be exposed to the world. So let's go ahead and start working on the controller. So I'm back in the application and I'm gonna go over to the project structure or folder and in the main package, which is right here. So I'm gonna right click and go to new, and I wanna create a new Java class. And this is gonna be called employee resource. Okay, this is gonna represent our controller. So let's collapse this. So the first thing I wanna do is I wanna annotate this as a REST controller because that's what it's going to be. It's gonna be a REST controller because this is a REST service. So we're gonna do REST controller. And another thing I want to do, I want to give this whole class a default or a base URL. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and say request mapping, and here I'm going to pass in a string. And to access this employee resource, I want all of the URL to have the employee at their base. Okay, so and you're gonna see how this is gonna make sense in a second. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to bring in the service because I need to use the service in this class. So let's do private final, and let's call the employee service. And of course, we need to inject that service into the constructor so that we can auto wire the service inside of that class. So I'm going to click here and go to more actions, and then I'm going to say add the constructor. And it's just gonna do the work for me, as you can see here. So the first method that I want to have in this class is one method that can return all of the employees that we have in the application. So for this, I need to give this a mapping. So let's do at get mapping because that's gonna be a get request to retrieve all of this information in the backend. And then what I wanna do here is define the actual body of the actual method. So let's do public, and I want this method to return an HTTP response. And there's a very handy class that we can use in Spring. It's called response entity, and that's the one that I'm going to use right now. So the response entity is a generic, so we have to pass in what type of data that's going to be in the body. Okay, so to do this, let's open and close, and here what we want to return is a list. Remember, list is also a generic, so we have to specify a list of what. So here we have to say employee. Okay, so this is going to return an HTTP response, and in the body of that HTTP response, there's going to be a list or an array of employee. And then at this point, we can name this method, let's say get all employee, and it's not going to take anything. And let's open and close the body of the method. And here, all we have to do is call the service and then have the service return all of the list of all the employees that it can find in the actual database. So let's do a list of employee, and let's call it employees. And what we want to do is to just call the service. So we can do employee service that find employees. So here, this is going to return the list of all the employees. Now you got to remember this method right here, it's returning a list of employee in the body. So we have to specify that. So what I'm going to do now is to just say return, and then here we're going to return the new response entity. And then inside of it, we're going to put all of our employees. So we're going to say employees, which is going to be in the body. And then we have to pass in the HTTP status code, which is going to be a success. So we can do HTTP status status okay, because everything went well. That way the user will know that they got a 200 response and everything went through perfectly. So this is something that we're gonna repeat. So we're gonna repeat this same format, and then we're just gonna call a different method on that service so that we can return whatever we need to return. So I'm gonna copy this method, I'm gonna scroll down a little bit, and then I'm gonna paste it. And I want another one to find a user. So let's say I want this mapping to go to /employee, which is at the class level, because we just define it right here. So every request will come through this, and then we can specify a more specific path here. So after employee, we can say find, and then we can pass in the ID as a path parameter. So here we're gonna pass in the ID. So this is gonna return only an employee. If you remember, we have one method that can return an employee by getting the ID. So we can call this get employee by ID, and then here we can take that ID. So the way we're gonna take that ID is to use an annotation called path variable, and then here we can say, hey, we're taking this ID coming from this path right here. So this ID right here and this ID here should match, and then we're gonna say, hey, this is gonna be a long and call it ID. Okay, so now we have access to this ID that was passed in the URL itself. And then here we're gonna return an employee. So I'm gonna remove this list and call this variable employee. And then here we can call find employee by ID. So we can do find employee by ID, and then we pass the ID in here. It's complaining you can't find employee, so we just have to return that one employee in the request by ID, and then send an HTTP response status code of OK to the user. And also we have to specify what we want this path to be. As you can see here, we're expecting this to go through employee /find and then the ID of the employee so that we can fire this method. But then here, only employee is expecting to reach this endpoint right here. So we can be more specific. We can just say, hey, for this one, we can specify an actual path. And for this, I'm gonna say all. So whenever they go to the base URL /employee /all, then it's gonna return the list of all of these employees. And we need 3 more methods. So there's gonna be another one to add an employee, update an employee, and delete an employee. So let's do those real quick. So what I wanna do is to create a method to add an employee. So let's do add, and that's gonna be a post request because we're making a change in the actual backend. So post mapping, and I'm gonna map this to employee, which is at the class level /add, okay, or something like that. And then here we're gonna define the body of the method. So I'm gonna do public, and of course it's gonna return a response entity of an employee. So I can just copy this line here and then paste it here, and I'm gonna call this method add employee. And then here we're expecting the whole employee object, which is gonna be in JSON format that we're gonna be expecting it coming from the user. So to get that information, the same way that we're getting this ID here, we can also use another annotation so that we can get whatever is coming in the body of the request as an employee. Okay, so we can say add request body, and in here we can just convert whatever we get as an employee because we know that's what it's going to be. So that way we will have access to the employee coming in from the body of the request. So here, all we have to do is to just create an employee. So I'm going to do employee, and here I want to call the service again, and I'm going to say add employee. And then here I just pass in the employee that I got from the actual request. And I'm getting an error because this employee that I'm defining right here is the same as this employee. So I'm just going to call this new employee or something like that. So new employee, which is the employee that they're adding. And then I can just pass it in the body of the response. So here I'm going to return a new response entity. So just copy this, and then I pass in this new employee right here. Okay. So now instead of returning an OK HTTP response, I'm going to return a created because that's what just happened. They just create a new piece of information in the application. So created means we created something on the server, which is what adding a new user is actually doing. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So now we need another one to update the employee, which is going to be very similar to this. The only difference is the employee that they're going to send us, that employee is going to have an ID because that employee already exists in our database. So I'm just going to copy this method and then paste it here. Instead of a post mapping, I'm going to do a put mapping because they're doing an update. So I'm going to do put mapping, and then here instead of add, I'm going to do update. And again, we're expecting the employee to come in, and the only difference is going to be that this employee that they're trying to update has an ID already in the database. So that way the database will be like, oh, this is an existing employee. Let me just update instead of doing a post or adding this new employee in our database. And here, I'm going to also rename this variable. So I'm going to call it update employee, and then return out of the employee. And then here, I'm going to return OK because everything goes well in the backend, so we return OK to the front end. And then here I just call update employee. And then lastly, we need one last method that can delete an employee. If you remember, we have a method that's going to delete an employee. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and go down a little bit more, and this is going to be delete mapping. So I'm going to delete this and do delete, and then this is going to go to the delete path. And of course we're expecting the ID because we need to delete by ID. So here in curly braces, I pass in the ID, and this is how you pass path variable in the actual URL that you can get by just calling this path variable like this. So I'm just going to copy this on top here, come down here and then paste it. And this is going to be called delete employee. So delete employee, and then we get the ID, and then here we can just call delete and pass in the ID here. And this method doesn't return anything. So instead of passing in an employee in the actual response entity, I'm just going to put a question mark, and then this doesn't return anything. So I'm going to remove this part. And then here we can just return OK to the user, just to let them know that everything goes well. So as you can see now, it's pretty much a mirroring of whatever we have in the service. So if we go back in the service real quick, you can see we have add, find all, which is going to return the list, update, find by ID, and then delete, which is exactly what we're doing in the controller. Now we can run this application, and then we can call those endpoints by sending requests to those endpoints. And then we should see something coming back to us in our client. That can be either the browser or Postman or Insomnia or whatever HTTP client that you're using. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Like I mentioned previously, we're going to need to use Postman to test our API. Because if we use the browser, we won't be able to send post requests and put requests or delete requests, because the browser can only send get requests, and through a form, the browser can send post requests, but we won't be able to do that. So I'm going to be using this HTTP client called Postman, and you just have to go to postman.com, and you will land to the Postman website where you can go ahead and download it on your computer by just clicking on this download at the top right corner. So Postman is an HTTP client. You can use it to send any type of request. And by any type, I mean with any one of the HTTP verbs. So you can send post requests, get requests, delete requests, put requests, or patch requests. And we're going to be using it to test the API. There's another one called Insomnia. So if you go to insomnia.rest, it'll take you to this page. And this one is also very popular. I've used it before myself, and they do the same thing. So it's really whatever you prefer, but either one of them will work fine. So I'm going to be using Postman, and I already have Postman installed on my computer. So I'm going to go ahead and open Postman so that we can use it. I have Postman open, and this is a brand new window of Postman. So I haven't made any requests or anything like that. It's clean. And all I have to do is to click on this plus sign right here and then open a new tab. And then in that tab, I can pass in the URL to the API that I want to call. And then I can select what type of request that I want to make. As you can see here, we have a list of pretty much all possible requests that we can make on the internet. So I need to pass in the URL. So that's going to be http://localhost. And remember, our application is running on port 8080. Well, it's not running yet, but when it runs on port 8080. We have to go to the base URL, which is employee. And let's say we want to go to the first endpoint here. So if we open the app back up, you can see there is a get mapping here that goes from employee to all. And this was going to return an array or a list of all the users that we have in the application. So then that means that once we pass in the employee, we have to pass /all. And this request is supposed to be a get request. It's going to go into the application and hit this endpoint right here. And this is going to run and then return the response to us. So let's go ahead and run the application, and then we can send that request and see what happens. So I'm going to go to the top right corner and then click on this green arrow. And the application is starting. And the application started. So if I scroll to the right a little bit here in the console, let me expand that a little bit. You can see that the app is running on port 8080, and this is the port number that we pass in our URL. So let's go back to Postman. As you can see, we're going to send that get request to /employee/all, and let's see what happens. So send. And here we got nothing back. We just have an empty array. And the reason for this is because we don't have any employees in the application yet. And we got a 200 status code response back. So that means that everything went well. It just didn't find any users on the backend, which is the database. So what we have to do now is to just add some new users and then see what we get back when we send that request again. So I'm gonna open a new tab and let's just copy the base URL here. So I'm gonna copy all of this and then paste it here. Now you have to remember this is gonna be a post request because we're trying to add a new piece of information on the server. And we can also double check the URL here. So if you scroll down a little bit here, you can see this is expecting a post request to the /add, and it's expecting an employee information. So here we're gonna do add. To send that employee in the request body, we have to click on body here and then go to raw. And we're gonna send JSON data. So in the text drop down, just click it and then select JSON. Once this request is sent, it's gonna send whatever is on the body as a JSON type of object or JSON data. So I have prepared some data. So I have this text.txt. I have a bunch of employees that I'm gonna send to the server to be sent to the database. So if you remember, if we go back a little bit to the employee class, you can see that we're supposed to send all of this information right here. So the name, the email, the job title, the font, and the URL for the image. But we're not gonna provide the employee code because this is gonna provide for us on the fly. And the ID is gonna be generated by JPA. So we don't need to pass in the ID and we don't need to pass in the employee code. So we're just gonna pass the name, the email, the job title, font, and an image URL. And this is exactly what I have in my data. So I have email, image URL, job title, name, and then phone number. So I'm gonna copy the first employee and then go back to Postman. And in that body, now I'm gonna paste this information here. So I'm gonna scroll this up so we can see the response when the response comes back. So again, we're sending a post request and it's gonna go to the /add so that we can add a new employee. And by default, this is accepting JSON data. So we select body so that we can put some JSON information or JSON data inside of the body of the request. And then we put the information that we need to put in JSON format. And I'm gonna go ahead and send this request now and let's see what happens. Let me see if I can scroll. So here you can see that now we have an ID for that user and we have an employee code, which is just a UUID. So you can see that this user was entered in the database because we have this 201 here, which is created because we created this new piece of information on the back end and everything went well. So now if we go back to the first tab where we can send the get request to get all of the employees, let's see if we're gonna get that employee back because we should. So let's send that request. And there you go. You see we have an array and in that array we have one element and this is the user that we just added. And we can verify this information in our database as well. So let me open the MySQL command line. Let's do MySQL and I want the command line client. And here I can put in my password. So let me in and I can do show databases and I can say use employee manager. Oops. And now we're using the employee manager database. And then here I can do show tables. You can see we have the employee table in here. And then I can say select star or everything from employee, which is the table name. And you can see here we have this new employee in the database. You can see here. This is the command line client that comes by default with MySQL. So we don't necessarily have to use this. I just like to use it because I like to use the command line, but you can use Workbench as well. And I have Workbench installed. So I'll be showing you this data inside of Workbench. So we can see that data was added. We can see the employee code, the image, and everything else that we're supposed to see. So this is all working. In the next video, we're going to continue by testing all the other endpoints. So I'll see you guys in the next one. I wanted to show you how you can use HTTP to do exactly the same things that we just did using Postman, sending all kinds of requests to the backend. So you can go to http.org and then install HTTP, and I believe you can install it with different tools. And I had to go through pip because I have a Windows computer, so I had to install Python and then install pip and then install it. It should be pretty easy for you if you have a Mac or Linux-based computer. So make sure you have HTTP. Again, this is totally optional. You don't have to do this. I just think it's really cool to use some command line to send HTTP requests, and HTTP is one of the best ones. So I'm gonna open my terminal here. I'm gonna make this a little bigger, and To use HTTP after you have installed it, you just have to do HTTP and then put in the URL for the request. So here I'm just gonna do HTTP :/localhost, and our port is 8080, and we want to go to employee/all. Okay, so this is gonna return the list of all the employees for us. Now, in the beginning, right after HTTP, you can pass in the method, which is going to be a GET request. But by default, it assumes that you're making a GET request. So we can omit this. We don't have to put it in. So now if we send that request, you can see we have a very nice response in JSON format. Another thing I want to show you is, let me scroll up a little bit. Since this is on our local, we don't actually have to pass in everything before the actual port number. So we can remove all of this, and it's going to assume that we're going to make that connection through localhost and port 8080. So if we send that again, you can see we get the same response. So I'm going to clear this, and the same way we can also find one employee. So I can remove this and do find, and let's pass 4, and just going to return the employee with ID 4. You can see now we have Andy Maxwell. So let's say we want to add an employee or do an update. How would we do that? Well, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's do HTTP, right? And let's do post. Now we have to specify this because by default, it's going to send a GET request. And here we're going to pass in the port because it's going to assume, since there's no URL, that we're making this request on our own local machine. So I'm going to pass 8080. And this is going to go to employee/add. Now, how do we pass the data? We can pass the data in many ways, but one of the best ways that I like to do this, and you can go through the documentation here. You can go through the documentation. It will show you how to do this. You can go here, you can find it. But one of the best ways is to actually have the data in a file and then point to that file. So before we send that request, I'm going to go ahead and generate that information. So I'm going to do touch, and I'm going to create a file called data.json. And remember, that information should be in JSON format. I'm going to create this, and then I'm going to do nano and open data.json. So in here, let's go back to the app. I'm going to grab employee number 3, which is Dave Rogers, which we deleted earlier. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to go back and put that information in. So I'm going to paste it. Okay, so now we have the same data in JSON format, and I'm going to exit this and save the changes. Now what I can do is do HTTP. I'm going to clear this first and do HTTP now, and that's going to be a post request, and it's going to go to localhost 8080/add, and then I just have to do this and pass data.json. So that way HTTP py is going to look inside of that file and then grab the information. So let's send this and see what happens. And you can see we added this employee with ID 5 and Dave Rogers here. So let's say we want to update Christine here. So let me go ahead and clear this, and I'm going to open the file again. So data.json, and I'm going to delete all of this and paste the information for Christine and close this. Now let's say I want to change the last name. So I'm going to go up and change that last name. I'm going to change this to Jones. Okay, and click Ctrl X, save, exit. So let's clear this and do HTTP, and then do a put request, and then that's going to go to 8080/employee/update, and then I can do the same thing. I can pass in the data.json. So now it's going to update that information. So let's put enter. As you can see here, now the last name is Jones. So we can do HTTP 8080 and see if we can get all the employee. So employee/all, and you can see here the last name Jones. So you might be thinking, oh, I don't need to use this command line interface. You know, I can just use Postman or whatever. Like I mentioned earlier, with the new cloud architectures that we're having right now, and cloud is just a big thing. It's like a buzzword in the tech world. A lot of times when you need to access your computer in the cloud, you're going to be logged in using a command line interface. and you will need to access information on the internet, make requests and things like that. So knowing how to make requests using a command line interface is very important. There's a very famous client that we can use called curl. Curl is like one of the most popular and it's been around for a while, but I just found out about HTTP Pie and I wanted to show you guys. So that's how you can, and you can do a lot more with HTTP Pie. If you go to the documentation, you can do pretty much everything you can do in Postman in HTTP Pie. So you guys can check it out and let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys in the next one. At this point, we're ready to build the front-end application. And for this, I'm going to be using a framework that's very popular. It's called Angular, and I'm going to be using a tool called Angular CLI so that I can create this application and manage it and run it and deploy it. So if you don't have the Angular CLI, you can just run npm install and then you do @angular/CLI. And if you don't have npm, of course, this is the Node package manager, so you can just go and install Node.js at nodejs.org and just install whatever version you want. Any version here will work. So once you have access to the Node package manager, you can just install the Angular CLI, and then we can run, ng new and then give a name for the application. And then we can cd into that folder, which is the folder of the application that will be created by the Angular CLI. And then you can do ng serve to just run the application on a local server. So I already have an npm install and I already have the Angular CLI installed. So I only have to run the second command and then go from there. So I'm just gonna open my terminal. I've already navigated in the folder, which is in my downloads folder where I want to create this application. So I'm just gonna do ng new and then give a name to the application. So I'm gonna call it employee manager app and run this. It's gonna ask me if I want to do if I want to have routing in the application. Now, if you remember, this is a one-page application, so I'm not gonna have any routing. So I'm gonna say no, and it's asking me what style sheet I want to use. Is it gonna be SCSS or SAS or LESS or CSS? So I'm gonna stick with CSS because I'm gonna be using Bootstrap. So I'm gonna be using CSS Bootstrap, and I'm just gonna run this. Now, while this is creating the application and building everything, let's take a quick look at the design of the application so that we can see where we are. So back in our design, and this is the same design that I showed you earlier when we were working on the back end. The only difference is this time we're focusing on the front end, which is why I put more details on the front end, which is the client. So we've already done everything on the server, at least for this small application that we're building. We've built a server, we built a controller, and we built our access to the database, and we have all the endpoints ready. So at this point, we just need to build the front end, and the front end is going to have a few different components. There's going to be a UI, which is going to be what the user is going to see on the screen. And then this UI is going to be connecting to a component, and that component will have access to a service. And then that service will be what will have access to the backend. So the service will be able to make HTTP requests to the backend, depending on what the user wants from the UI through the component, through the service, and then over the internet, we're going to access our backend. So this is the little design that I have for this application. And the first thing we're going to be doing once we have the front-end application or Angular application ready is to build the service in that application so that we can communicate with our backend. So we're going to pretty much have a mirror of what we have in the backend. So we have like an endpoint to update on an employee, so we're going to have that as well in the service. We have an endpoint to add an employee. We're also going to have that in the actual client service. And once we have the service ready, we'll be able to use it to update our UI. And this is going to be done through the component because the component is like a middleware here. So hopefully this is making sense because it's a very, very simple application. We're not really doing anything really complicated. Obviously, this application is very simple. It's like one of the simplest application you can build, at least for this design that I'm trying to do, like having a backend and front end. But again, applications like this can get really, really complex. You can have proxies in between and all kinds of stuff. But we're not going to be doing that. We're just going to keep it very simple. I just want to show you how you can actually go about designing a backend application and a front end application using Spring, and then front end application using Angular. And the backend application is framework or library agnostic, which means you can use pretty much anything that can communicate with a backend. You can use vanilla JavaScript to make like simple fetch requests, or you can use React.js, or you can use React Native. Like, you can use anything that you can use to make any HTTP request to communicate with any server. The backend will work with it as well. So we didn't necessarily have to use Angular. It just happened to be the framework that I'm just choosing you. But you could use AngularJS or React.js or React Native or whatever front end you want, or just plain old vanilla JavaScript, just making a simple request to the backend as long as you know what the endpoints are. So the process has finished. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cd into that folder. So I'm gonna do employee manager app. And here I can just run ng-serve just to start the application on a local server. And we're just gonna give this some time to come up. The application has started and we can access it in localhost 4200. This is just the default port. Of course, you can override that by just passing a simple argument. So let's go and access this. So we're gonna do localhost and port 4200. And you can see we have this page, which is just the default page that you get when you create an Angular application. So here it is. This is the front end application. Right now, there's really nothing going on here. This is just a simple page that they give us with some documentation information. So in the next video, we're just gonna go ahead and start creating the service so that we can communicate with the backend. What I want to do now before we continue adding more function is to create the employee interface so that we can specify the type of data that these requests are going to be returning. So I'm going to go back here and into the app folder. I'm going to create a new file and I'm just going to call it employee.ts. And then inside here, I'm just going to do export interface employee, open and close curly braces. And here I'm just going to define all of the attributes that employee is going to have. So they're going to have an ID and that's going to be a number. They're going to have a name and that's going to be a string. They're also going to have an email. Hopefully I can remember everything that I said in the back end. And I remember job title. So job title. And this is also a string. And they have a phone, which is a string. Image URL, which is also a string. And then they have an employee code. I think this is everything that we set in the back. And then we can come back and change this if we forgot something. And this is also a string. So this represents the type of data that's going to be returning whenever we make those calls to the backend, because we're just technically mirroring what an employee looks like from the backend. So I'm just going to copy this and close it and collapse this. So now we can say, hey, this is going to return an observable of employee array. We can just passing it like this and make sure we import employee from our class. And then down below, we can pass in the same type as well. It's explicitly clear what type of data that this is returning, which is an employee array from a JavaScript perspective, or from a Java perspective, that's just going to be a list or any type of collection. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and go down here and then paste it. And this is going to be add employee. And for this, it's going to take the actual employee that we're adding. So I'm going to do employee, and that's going to be of type employee, which is our type that we just created. And this is going to return just one employee. So I'm going to remove those brackets. And here we just have to pass in the employee. So the URL, the base URL, which is this part of the URL, is going to be the same, but this time it's going to go into employee.add. And then we have to pass in the payload, which is just the employee that we received, which can be a second argument. And then here we just have to change this method from get to post, which is why it's complaining. And this is how we're going to make the post request to this URL and then pass in the payload and the body so that we can add that employee into the application in the backend. And I'm going to duplicate this one more time. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. And this one is going to be to update an employee. So I'm going to change this to update. And it's going to take an employee. It's going to return an employee. And it's going to go to update instead of add. So we're going to change this to update. And of course, in the body of the request, we're passing the employee to be updated. So all of this is good. And also, we have to change this from a post to a put because we're updating the data. And I'm going to duplicate this one more time. I'm going to go down here. And for this one, it's going to be the function to delete an employee. So I'm going to remove this update and then put delete. And to delete an employee, we need to pass in the actual employee ID. So I'm going to do employee ID, and the type for this is going to be a number. And whenever we delete an employee, we don't send any response back in the response body. We just send back the whole HTTP response with the status. So in this case, we can just say this is going to return void. And then we can change this to delete. And then of course, we're not passing in this. We're just adding this ID as part of the URL itself. So here we can just go to the delete route and then / that employee ID. And we can just pass this by just passing in the $, open and close curly braces, and then pass in the employee ID here as part of the URL. So this is pretty much everything. And as you can see, this is just a clear mirroring of whatever we have in the backend. So we can get all the employees by passing in a GET request to that specific URL, which is employee/all, and then update, add and delete. So we can now use all those functions in our component so that we can update our UI appropriately depending on what action the user is taking in the UI. There's something I want to show you, and this is the CLI page on angular.io/CLI. And this is the page on Angular, or the Angular website, that is dedicated to the CLI. And if you go on this page, you can see everything that you can actually do with the CLI. And you just saw that we just did this, ran these 3 commands. And what I want to do now is to generate the service that I need. So if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see this table. And on this table, you can see all the different commands that you can use. And you can click on them to see more details about them. So I'm going to click on the generate because I'm trying to generate a new service or anything else. And if you scroll down a little bit, you can see we have everything here that we can actually generate. So we can use this generate here with any of those arguments here. So what I want to do is to create a service. So I'm going to go down here and click on service. You can see it gives me the actual command. So I can do ng generate service and then pass in the name of the service with some options. So I'm just going to copy this and then go back to my terminal. And I'm going to stop the server for a second, and I'm going to clear this. And here I'm just going to pass in this command, and then I'm going to give this a name. So I'm going to call it employee. So what the Angular CLI is going to do is do employee.service. It's going to add the service to this. So before I run this, there's something else I want to show you. So if you scroll down here, you can see if we want to skip tests, we can set this skip test, options to be true or false. So I don't want to have any tests. So I'm going to copy this because I don't want to generate the test file. And then I'm going to delete all of this. So that way it won't create the spec file or the test file. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. As you can see now, the CLI went ahead and created this file, which is employee.service.ts, and it didn't create a spec file, which I don't need. So at this point, I can just do code and then a dot, and this is going to open Visual Studio Code. So now I have Visual Studio Code open, and I'm just going to navigate to the service. I'm going to go into the source and the app, and then here's the employee service.ts file. So in this file, what we need to do, we need to create some function that can actually reach to the backend to do some work for us. So we'll have a function to add an employee, update an employee, delete an employee, and etc. So to do this, we need to have some way to make HTTP requests. And the way to do this in Angular is to use something called the HTTP client. And this is a built-in HTTP client that we can use to make HTTP requests. And we can just inject it in the service so that we can use it. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to go on here and I'm just going to do private, and I'm going to call it HTTP, and it's going to be of type HTTP client. And make sure this is imported. This is supposed to come from Angular common.http. So once we have access to this HTTP client, we can actually start making HTTP requests to the backend. So I'm going to create a first function. I'm going to do public, and I'm going to call it get employees, so that I can get a list of all the employees. Of course, this function is not going to take any parameters, and it's going to return an observable. So I'm going to do observable, and I'm just going to give it a type because the observable is a generic. So I'm going to say any for now, but then later we're going to create a specific interface that can represent our employees in the backend. So for now, I'm just going to pass in any, so it's going to return an observable of anything. And then I can just call the HTTP client to make the request. So I'm going to return this, that HTTP client or the HTTP that I have. And then I need to make a GET request here. As you can see, we have access to many different types of HTTP request method. And for this, I need to send the GET request because that's what the backend is expecting. So I'm going to select GET. And then here I have to pass in just the URL. So here I'm going to go up top and then define a URL for that. So I'm going to do private. And I'm just going to call it API server URL. And I'm going to set it equal to some empty string for now. We're going to put that URL in later. So now I can just pass in the actual URL to the server where this request is supposed to be made. And again, the get method is also a generic, as you can see. So for now, I'm just going to pass in any and then pass in the actual URL. So this is going to be the URL that we define up top. So I'm going to pass in a backtick and then I'm going to do a $, open and close curly braces. And this is a simple JavaScript notation that you can use to put variable and then string at the same time. So I'm going to do this, that API URL. So this is going to be our URL. And then I can pass in some more data. So I can do / employee, and this is supposed to be to go to all. So what we're doing in this function is to tell the HTTP client where to make the request and the type request to make. So here we call in the HTTP client and then we say, hey, this is going to be a GET request and the return type is going to be anything for now. We're going to change that in a minute. And the whole point of using TypeScript is to have type. So we have to specify what type of data we're expecting to get back. And since this is a GET request, we don't need to pass in anything in the body and we don't have any headers. So we just pass in the URL here. So we're going to be repeating this process until we can have a function to add employee, update employee, delete employee. We have this service. Now we can go ahead and use it in our component. So let's go to the component.ts, which is this file. The first thing I want to do is to define a variable that's going to hold all of our employees whenever we get them back. So I'm going to do public, and this is public because it's going to be used in the HTML file, and by default it's public. So you don't necessarily have to say public. I'm just coming from a strongly typed language, so I like to put all my access modifier, but you don't necessarily have to do this. So I'm going to call this employees because it's going to hold all of the employees coming from the backend, and I'm going to give it a type of employee array. And I do this by passing in those brackets here, and I need to import employee, and that's coming from our class. Now I can go down below and create another function that I can use to call our service. So to do this, we're going to need to inject this service in this class as well, the same way that we did inject the HTTP client, as you can see here, inside of this class. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and go back here, and in the constructor, I'm going to put a new line. I'm going to call in the employee service. So I'm going to call it employee service, and that's going to be of type employee service. And of course, we need to import that from our service. So make sure you import employee service from wherever your service is. So now we have access to the service because we just injected it into this app component. So what we can do, we can create another function. So I'm going to do public. I'm going to call it get employees. And it's not going to accept any parameters, and it's going to return void. And what I want to do inside of this function is to call our service. So I can do this employee service that get employees. And since this is an observable, so it's going to make a request over the internet or over the network, and this is going to take some time. That's why it's returning an observable. So we need to subscribe to that observable. So after we call the function, we have to call subscribe so that we can be notified whenever some data comes back from the server. Either that could be the actual employees that we requested or some kind of an error. And here I'm just going to specify our response. So I'm going to say if we get a response back, which is going to be of type employee array, because that's what it's going to be, then we're going to execute some piece of code here. And what we want to do is to set this variable that we define up top to be equal to the body of the request, because by default, using an observable, it's just going to give you whatever response is coming back inside of that body of the response. So we can set this equal to response, which is going to be the list or array of all of our employees. Otherwise, which in this case of an error, we also have to handle that. So in case we get an error, which is going to be of type HTTP error, and we have to import that. So in case it's an HTTP error response, what we want to do is execute a different piece of code. In that case, I can just send an alert or just console log it to the console, and I can just console that error message. So I can just access the error object, and then there's a message that I can access here. So we can just see it as an alert. So now we can see that this component will have all the employees in it whenever we call this function. So we can use this variable inside of the template, because as you can see, it is the template for this specific component, which means it's communicating directly with this component. So we can access this variable inside of this HTML file. So we need to be able to call this function whenever this component is loaded or whenever it's initialized. And one way we can do this is to just implement an interface called onInit. So I'm going to do implement, it's called onInit. And then once we implement onInit, which is coming from Angular core, then we need to override a function called ng onInit. So I'm gonna go right below the constructor and I'm gonna do ng onInit, and it doesn't take any parameters. And all I have to do now is to call our function inside of this ng onInit, because it's gonna run whenever this component is initialized. So I can do this, get employees, and that's just the name of our function down below. So now whenever this component is initialized, it's going to call this function, and this function in turn is going to call our function that we just defined down here, and then it's going to set our employees whenever we get the response back from the server. And if we get an error, then we're just going to send an alert to show that error to the user. So now I can go into the component where we have all of our HTML, and we don't need all this stuff. This is just the default that came with Angular. And all I want to do now is to just define some div. So I'm going to do div, and inside of this div, I can just use ng4 so that I can loop on all of the actual employees that I'm getting from the backend. So I can just do ng4 and then set this equal to let employee, which is going to be a local variable of employees, which is the variable coming from the actual component. So then it's going to loop over every single one of those employees and save each one of them in a variable called employee. So inside that div, then I can go ahead and create another div. And then let's say I want to display the name of the employee. So I can do string interpolation, and then I can access the local variable employee, and then I can do .name. As you can see, I have intelligence because I defined the type as an interface in the application. So I can access the name of the employee. So we can do just that for now, just so we can see the name of the employee. And to close this and remove this div here, and remove this extra. So that's very simple. I just want to show you guys what we get back from the actual server. And there's one last thing to do, is to just go back. You can see the employee service. We have to specify the actual URL, which is localhost 8080. So the way I want to do this is to go into the environment folder. And inside of the environment folder, we have two files here. There's one environment configuration file for production and one for development. So we're going to put this in our development because right now we're on localhost. So we're using the one for development. As you can see, production is false on this one. For production, you can see production is true here. So we're not using this because we're not going into production yet, but we're going to use the one for development. So I'm going to go back into the environment for development. And then here, I'm just going to pass in a new attribute to this, and it's gonna be just API base URL. You can just give this any name you want. I'm gonna set this equal to our URL, which is http:// localhost, and that's 8080. And this is the URL for the server for our backend. So now we can access this URL using our variable. So let's go back into the employee service. So here, instead of empty string, we can just call the environment, which is down here. And then we can just access the API-based URLs. So Visual Studio Code is importing everything for me, but you really have to make sure that you're importing everything, and you have to make sure that all the packages are coming from the right place, like HTTP clients coming from HTTP, from Angular coming to HTTP, and observables coming from RxJS. So now we have access to our base URL here. And one last thing we have to do to configure the service is to let the entire Angular application app know about the service. So we're doing this here by injecting it here and then saying provided in root, which is the root component of our app. In that case, that would be this component right here, this module. So if we don't have this, then we have to register this service as a provider in here. So you would go here and then say employee service like this. Okay, so you either do it like this just by saying provide it in root, or you just do it manually in here like this. So now our service is configured and the entire Angular application is aware of it. And we can go ahead and give this a try. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and start the front-end application, and then we're gonna check it out in the browser. So I'm gonna go to View and then Open View. I want to open the terminal panel, and then I'm just gonna do ng-serve, and we're gonna let this come up. Now also make sure the backend is running. So my backend is running. Since this is making calls to the backend, you have to make sure that the backend is running as well. And as you can see here, my backend is running and it's listening on port 8080. So let's wait for this to come up. And the application is up. So let's go in the browser and take a look. I'm gonna go ahead and click OK and let this refresh. And it looks like we get an error, and that's because we didn't bring in the HTTP module. So whenever you're using the HTTP client, you have to bring in the HTTP module in the app module file. So I'm gonna close this for a second, and as you can see here, we're using the HTTP client. So I have to go into the app module and then bring in the HTTP client module. So here I'm just gonna do HTTP client module and make sure it's imported here from the same package, and let the app rebuild. Gonna open the terminal again. As you can see, the app compiled successfully. So let's go back to the browser, and now I'm getting a course error. So as you can see here, we're not able to reach out to the backend because of course configuration. And technically what this is, it's a policy that is enforced in all modern browsers, which means that an application running in one domain cannot access resources in another domain, or in an application running in another domain. So we have to put a configuration in the backend to tell the backend, say, hey, allow this front-end application running on this origin or this URL to access your resources. And if you want to know more about it, you can just go to this documentation from Mozilla, and you can read more about it here. As you can see, it's a mechanism that uses HTTP headers to tell browsers to give a web application running in one origin access to selected resources from a different origin. So that's technically what's happening with us, because this application is running on localhost 4200 and the backend is running on localhost 8080. So they can't communicate with each other because they belong to different domains, unless the backend explicitly say, hey, allow this application running on this domain to access your resources. So let's go back to the backend. And I'm gonna minimize this for a second, and I'm gonna go to the main application class, and then I'm gonna put a course configuration here. So the course configuration is really boilerplate code. It's just something that you're probably gonna, copy paste in every single application and then do slight modification to it. So I'm just gonna paste the code, and then I'm gonna walk you through it. So I'm gonna go down here and then paste it. And you can see it's a course filter configuration. So all we're doing here is to create a course filter. And for this, we need the course configuration. So in the configuration is where we set what we want. So here you can see I'm allowing credential. I'm setting the allowed origin. In that case, it's our application running on 4200. And then below, I'm allowing certain headers. So origin, accept, authorization, etc. And then I'm also exposing certain headers. So you have to add all of those to the configuration. And I need to import this. And then we have to pass that configuration to a URL course configuration. So because this is all URL based, so we say, hey, create this new object, which is a URL based course configuration, and then pass our configuration, which is the regular course configuration. And we set that to all the routes in the application, which is the root route of the application, which is /**. And then we return a new course filter with that URL based course configuration. So that's all we have to do here, and make sure you have everything imported. And this is really a piece of code that I just have somewhere in some GitHub repository, and I just copy and paste it every time, and then I make some slight modification to it, because it's pretty much going to be the same every time you're building this type of application and then you want access to some front-end application. So you'll probably have some configuration similar to this. So that's why I just have it somewhere, and I just copy and paste it every time. And then I change the headers that I want to expose and the methods that I want to expose. So now I'm going to go ahead and restart this backend application. So I'm going to restart it and let it come up. So the application is up. Let's see. All right, so we're running. So let's go back to the browser and let this refresh. And now if I zoom in, you can see, since we're console logging the employees, you can see they're all here. And if I zoom in here, you can see we have all the employees here. So our app is working as expected. So what I'm going to do in the next lecture is to just show you guys the UI that I'm going to be using, or the HTML template that I'm going to be using. So I'll see you guys in the next one. So for right now, the app looks like this. And the UI that I'm going to be using is at this website, bootday.com. So if you navigate to this URL, you'll land onto this page and you can see this snippet that you can use, and you can use it. It's under a free MIT license. As you can see here, permission is granted free of charge to any person obtaining a copy of the software, blah, blah, blah. So you can use this template or snippet. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see the HTML code for it. So you can just copy that to your clipboard and then paste it wherever you need to. And here's the custom CSS styling for this. So this whole snippet is using Bootstrap, but there's a little bit of custom styles that you need, and that's down here. And you can just copy it to your clipboard and then paste it to your style. So I'm going to go ahead and paste the HTML code for this along with the CSS, and then I'm going to import Bootstrap into the project as well. So if you don't know what Bootstrap is, obviously I'm assuming you guys know what it is. It's a CSS framework that's like extremely popular. You can just Google Bootstrap and then you'll see what it is. And there's like tons of resources online that you can use to learn it. So let's go ahead and make our app look pretty. I'm going to go to the application and I need to go to the template. So I'm going to go to the template and I'm going to remove all of this and then paste the code for the snippet that I just showed you. So I'm going to paste it. I'm gonna close that for now. And then I need to bring in everything for Bootstrap and the custom style. So I'm gonna go to the style for this app. So scroll down to the bottom, you'll see this file called styles.css. And then in there, you can import style, like you can import a CDN, or you can just add custom styling or whatever CSS styles that you want. So I'm gonna go back to the website and scroll down. I need to copy this. So I'm gonna copy it. Back and paste it. I don't think we're using this body here, but I'm just gonna leave it anyways. And then I need to import Bootstrap because this is powered by Bootstrap and this part is only the custom CSS styling for this. So we need to import Bootstrap as well. So I'm gonna go up here and then paste the Bootstrap link along with the Font Awesome CDN so that we can have access to the little icons that we saw. So now if we go back, and I'm gonna zoom out and close this for now. You can see we have this navigation bar and then we have this card right here, which is the same card as this one. We just haven't put in all the information on it yet, but it's the same card. So I'm gonna walk you through the template a little bit. So let's go back to the app and I'm gonna collapse this, close this style, and I'm gonna scroll up. So at the top, I have a navigation. So as you can see from line 1 to line 16, this is the whole nav bar. And then I have a form here. So this is this form right here to search an employee, which is this form from line 12 to line 14. And then I have a button right here and it's this button right here. So I can click it. Well, I can't click it now because it's not going to do anything, but this is the button, which is add employee. So what I want to do is to loop over these cards and then create as many cards as I need for every single employee. So let's go back to the app, and the same way that we did earlier when we were just showing the names of the employee, we can do something similar. So I'm going to go up here, and as you can see here, we have the cards right here. So from line 20 to line 40, that's just the card information with the buttons on it and everything. So I can just go here in the element above, and then I'm just gonna do an ng4. So I'm gonna do star ng4 and set that equal to let local variable, so employee of employees, which is the variable coming from the template. So just so you guys remember, if I go back to the template, I'm referencing this employees here, which is the arrays of all the employees that I'm getting from the backend. And I'm just creating this local variable here for every single one of those as I loop through them. So now I can use this local variable in this card, and that's going to create as many cards for as many employees. So I'm going to copy this, and for the image right here, I'm going to pass in this employee dot image URL. And another thing I want to do is to put a safe navigation operator. So it's going to look like this. You just put a question mark. So what this is doing is it's making sure that this employee exists before it tries to access any attributes on that employee. which is a safe way to navigate to a certain attribute. So sometimes if you don't have that and then the browser is trying to parse this URL right here or whatever it is that you're trying to access on that employee and that employee doesn't exist yet or it's not loaded yet, then it's going to throw an error in the browser. So to avoid that, you put this question mark right here, and that's just a safe way to navigate to attributes on an object. So I'm going to come down here. I'm just going to copy this. And in the H5, I'm going to just put the name of the employee. So I'm going to do name. And in the paragraph here, in the P, I'm going to add the job title. So I'm going to do this and do job title. And then I'm going to go down below here. I'm going to put the email. So I'm going to do email. And then here, I'm just going to do the phone. And phone. And I need another curly braces. One here and one more here. And another one here. Okay, so I'm going to save this and make sure this reloads. Open the terminal. You can see compiled successful. Oh, it's compiling right now. Just give it a second. Okay, so let's go back to the browser. As you can see here, we have all the information. It doesn't look quite right, so I think I miss a curly braces and the employee name. So let's go back. And right here, I'm just gonna put the close curly braces and save and let it rebuild. And go back and let this refresh. And now you can see we have all of the information for all the employees. And I don't see the email. As you can see here, the email is missing. So let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm gonna close this, go down. And that's because we put this in the icon. So we have to remove this here and put it in the LI, which is the list item. And save it and go back. Let this reload. And now our UI looks good. So for now, this is all we're doing is just listing all of the employees, and those buttons are not working. So we're going to have to work on those buttons as well. As you can see, we didn't have to create all this HTML code ourselves. So it's really helpful to just use those templates and then just leverage them or just make slight modification. As you can see here, I remove all of the social links because I'm not using them. So that was pretty easy. But then I use everything else, and that looks pretty cool. So that's another thing in software development. So you have to leverage as much code as you can. Now, you always have to give credit to the author of a piece of a code, but if you can leverage something, then you have to leverage it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Now the app looks good, but we have zero functionality. So if we click on this, nothing happens. We click on those buttons, nothing happens. So what I want to do is to have a model come up every time we click on one of those buttons. So if they click on add employee, I want this model to come up, or a pop-up layer or pop-up window to come up with a form where they can put in the employee information and then two buttons at the bottom of that form, one to save or one to close to or to cancel. And I want the same for the edit. So when they click on edit, I want a pop-up window to come up, and that pop-up window should be pre-filled with the existing employee information, and then they can edit it and then save. And when they click on the X here or delete, I want a pop-up layer to come up again or a modal, and they can either delete or cancel. So as you can see, those three functionalities are very similar. The models are going to be different, or the layers are going to be different, but all of the three functionalities are the same. So if we go back to the template, and I'm going to close this for now, I'm going to scroll up a little bit. So we have this button here to add an employee, and this right here is the list of all of the employee with the cards. So we're not going to do anything there. But down here, we have the two buttons. So as you can see here, we have the pencil button with the pencil icon, and the other one to delete. So we have the edit and the delete buttons right here. So we can create a function that can take care of that for us. We can create a function that every time we click it, we pass in some parameters that tells which model to open. So we can create one function that can open all three of the models. So as you can see, we have the add model here. I'm just going to collapse it. And then we have the edit model here. I'm going to collapse it. And then we have the delete model here. I'm going to collapse it. And this is the notification that you're seeing, which we're going to only display when there is absolutely no employees to show. So we have to add those functionalities so that we can have a working application. So I'm going to go back to Bootstrap, and I'm just going to click on Bootstrap 4. I think that's the one that this guy is using for this template. So I'm gonna close those for now because I don't need them. And I'm gonna search for a modal. I need to understand how this thing works. So if you scroll down a little bit, you see an example here. And what I'm interested in is this button right here. So you can have a button to launch them. So if you see, I can click it and then it comes up. Okay, so we have the modals already. So we have those lines of code already in the application. We just need to have this button here. Now there's two ways, at least I know, you can approach this. You can either have those buttons and then you call this button and then click them, or you can do everything programmatically. So in my case, I'm going to do everything programmatically. So as you can see here, we need to have this button here. The type has to be a button, and then we don't care about this class because we're not going to display this button. And then we need to give it a data toggle, which is going to be model. We need to give it a data target, which is going to be the ID of the model itself, as you can see here, or modal, or however this is pronounced. So we can programmatically create a button, and depending on what button they click on the UI, so either add employee or edit or delete, we pass in this ID to that function, and then they can call the proper modal. So just so I can use this for an example, I'm just going to show you how we can do this in a programmatic way. I'm going to go back to the TS file, and then right down below here, I'm going to create a new method. So I'm going to do public, and I'm going to call it on open modal. And what I want to pass is employee. So I'm going to pass in the employee. So that would be the employee that they're either adding or editing or deleting. And I want to pass a mode, and that's going to be a string. So what the mode is going to tell me is what exactly the user is trying to do. So that will help me determine which modal or model to open. So if the mode is add employee, for example, then we're going to open the add employee modal. If it's edit, we're going to open edit, etc. So this function is not going to return anything. So I'm going to pass in void as the return type, and then open and close curly braces. So the first thing I want to do is create the button. So I'm going to do const button, and I'm going to say document that create element, and we're going to pass in the name of the element that we wanted to create. In that case, it's going to be a button. So we have the button created. So this is this button right here. Okay, so it's going to create this button right here. We don't have those attributes yet, like the data toggle and the data target. We're going to add those in a minute. So we created the button. So we have to change the type to a button, because by default, when we create a button, the type is submit, and we're not going to use this button for any submission. So we have to change the type on that button. So down below, we're going to do button.type, and we're going to set that to a string that's going to be button. Okay, so we changed the type from submit, which is the default, to button. And since we're not going to display this button, I can also set some styling to display none. So I can do button, that style, and I can access the display. As you can see, it comes up here, and then I can set that equal to none. And you know, if you know a little bit of CSS, you know this is just gonna hide it in the UI, because we don't need to show that button. We already have our button, like those buttons right here and this link right here to call and then open the modal. So we don't need this. We don't need to show this button anywhere on the UI. So that's why I'm displaying. I set the display to none. I'm gonna scroll up a little bit. So let me go back and let's see what I want to do next. So what I want to do next is to add this attribute, which is the data toggle, which is gonna be model. So that's gonna be model for every single one of them. So we don't need to change that. So I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna go down. I'm gonna say for this button, I want to add some attributes. So I'm gonna do set attribute. And in here, I'm gonna pass in the attribute that I want to add. In that case, that's gonna be the data toggle. So I'm gonna do data toggle, and I want to set this to modal and semicolon. So what I'm doing here is to add this to this button, and I'm just doing that programmatically instead of doing it manually by just creating the button and the element. Now the data toggle, which is going to be the ID of the model that I want to open, is going to be dynamic. So I'm not going to set a value for it yet. So let's go back. And what I want to do is to check what mode that the user is in, which means which one of the button that they click. So to do this, I'm going to create an if statement. So I'm going to do if the mode, which I'm getting from my function here. I'm going to say if this is equal to add, then I know they're trying to add an employee, then in that case, I can set a different attribute for the data target. So I'm just gonna copy this, paste it down here, and I wanna change this to data target. And that's gonna be the ID of the model that I wanna open. So let's go back to the UI. So for the first one, which is the add, I want to add this ID right here, which is add employee modal. So I'm going to copy this, go back, and then put this down here. So what I want to do is do the same thing for every single one of the different modals that I have. So I'm just going to copy this if statement, go down here, I'm going to paste it. One more time, I'm going to paste it. For the second time, I'm going to look for edit, like if they're trying to do an edit, and the third time I'm gonna look for a delete. So if the mode is delete, we're gonna open the delete modal, which means we're gonna pass in a different data target. So here I'm gonna come back here and then grab this ID for the update. So as you can see, edit or update employee modal, pass this in as the data target, and for the last one I'm gonna pass in the delete employee modal, just like that. So depending on which button they click, this attribute, which is going to be the data target, is going to be different. And I think since this is referencing an ID, I need to put the hash sign. So I'm going to put hash sign here and all three of them, just like that, and scroll up a little bit. So now what I want to do is to add this button somewhere in the template itself. So as we can see, the button only exists in the JavaScript or the TypeScript world here. The button is not on here. So we need to have a way to place this button somewhere here. So I'm gonna scroll up a little bit, and I'm gonna give this main container, which is like the main container for the page, I'm just gonna give it an ID, and I'm just gonna call it main container or something like that. Okay, so now we can grab this element and then we can add the button in this div right here, which is the main div of the main page. So let's go back here, and I'm just gonna scroll up a little bit. I create another constant. I'm gonna call it container, and I'm just gonna do document get element by ID, and then I'm gonna pass in the ID. I'm gonna go back, just copy that ID, and then paste it here. Okay, so now we have access to this entire div right here on line 17. So now what we can do inside this div, we can just add this button. So we can go down here after all the checks are done so that we know which data target to add to this button. We can come down here, and then in the container we can do append child, and then here we just pass in the button, which is this button right here that we create, just like that. So now the button exists in this HTML template. It exists under DOM, and all we have to do after that is just click this button. So I can just do this button, that click. There's a click you can call on the button, as you can see here, it's coming up, and then we click the button because that's what we're trying to do. So now the button will have all of those attributes on it, and then when we click the button, it will open the appropriate model. So now the only thing we have to do, there are some scripts that we need, that Bootstrap needs to be able to open the modal with this click of a button with those data toggle and data target. So let's go back to the main file of the application, which is the index.html. This is the file that's going to be ultimately served in the browser. And then I'm just going to go down here at the bottom and then paste those script. As you can see, there's just jQuery and then Popper and then Bootstrap min.js. Those are just the JS file that you need to have whenever you're using Bootstrap, and you need to have your model to come up because there's like things happening in the script in the background that's making this happen. And if you don't know where to get those, we can go back to the Bootstrap and then go to get started, and you can see here's the CSS for the styling, and then here's all of the JS that you need, and that's what we just pasted in there. As you can see, we have the jQuery, Popper, and then Bootstrap. So that's exactly what we just did, just right here. So I'm gonna close this, and I'm gonna open the terminal again, and I'm just gonna save this. And now if we add this button over to a click listener, we should be able to open either of the models. So let's go back to the template. I don't need that quite yet. And I'm gonna scroll up. So here I'm gonna add a click listener. So I'm gonna do click. And what I want to do is call the function that I just created. So here I'm going to pass in the name of the function. And for this one, I need to pass in an employee. And since this is the open model, so I don't have the employee yet because they're trying to like create a new employee. I'm going to pass in null. And for the mode, I'm just going to pass in add. I'm going to do add. Okay. So that means that this is the add employee. So it's going to do all the proper logic, which is going to be here, and then click the button. So let's go back. I'm just going to copy this click event listener and then go down here. So here we have the two other buttons. So to edit and then delete an employee. So I'm going to add the click listener on those link. So I'm going to put this here and then I'm going to put this here. And here I can pass in the employee because remember we're looping. So we have access to this employee here, which is the local variable that we define here. So if every time it loops, we have access to this employee that is in the current iteration of the loop. So instead of passing null, we pass in the employee here. And then here is going to be edit. And this is going to be delete, which is the strings that we're looking for here. Edit, delete. So now if we save all of this, and let's make sure this is compiling. Okay, so now if we go back to the app, if I click add employee, now you can see we open the add employee model. We click on edit, we open the edit employee model, and if we click on delete, we open the delete. Obviously this is not working yet because we haven't added all the functionalities, but that's just one way to do this programmatically to open different models on the screen. Another approach to this is to put those buttons, like you would put 3 buttons on the HTML template itself, and then you would hide those buttons. Like so you would put this style display none on this button, and then you would get this button like this. So you do document get element by ID, and then you get the button, and then you can just call the click on it. So I think this is a little bit cleaner. It's more agile because you have one function that will do the same thing. So you don't have to put all those unnecessary elements on the page and things like that. So I'll see you guys in the next one. So we have a logic here. So we have 3 if statements. I'm gonna bring this down a little bit so you guys can see the whole function. I want to debug this a little bit just to make sure that, you know, everything is taking the appropriate route so that I make sure that the logic is working properly. We have 3 if statements. So just to be sure, at least one time, just check this out to make sure it's working properly. So I'm gonna go back to the browser and I'm gonna right click and do inspect. And I want to go to source because I want to see the actual file and debug them. So if you don't see the TS file, like whenever you go to source, you can go to Webpack. I'm going to collapse this and then go to this dot folder and then go into the source. You can see this is the folder of the app, and then go into app and then go into the employee, well, app component.ts. And then now I'm going to collapse this. So you can see now we have access to the code that we just written. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here by just clicking on that line number 33. And then I'm going to click to make sure that it's taking the appropriate logic route whenever I click on whatever button. So if I click on add, it should go into this logic and then run this 2 lines at the bottom, 47, 48. So if I click on add, it comes here, it stops at the breakpoint. So I'm going to click on this arrow to step over. So I'm going to go 1, 2, okay, keep going. So it's gonna come here. So now I want to see what's in the button so you can see all of those attributes. So if I hover over it and scroll down a little bit, and you can see here all the information on the button, and scroll down a little bit more, you can see the outer HTML for the button. So you can see here we have a button of type button, and the data toggle is modal, and the style is display none. Okay, so our button is looking good. So now after this line, we should see the data target. So if I step over, so it goes into this if statement on line 39 because the mode is add, and we can hover over mode, we can see the mode is add coming from the template. So it's gonna go over again, and then this is gonna be false, so it won't do this line on line 42. It won't do line 45. Skip it. And now it's going to add this into the container, which is, you can see when I hover over it, it's the entire page. So I'm just adding this button anywhere on that page. So I'm going to click. So now the button is in here somewhere. because I added it to the template, which is the main container or the main div of the application. And then now I'm just going to click that button. So if I finish this, you can see this comes up. I can close it and then click on edit. It's going to stop here again. So this time it should go into line 42. So we're going to skip this because we already know what's going to happen. So it's going to come on line 38. It's supposed to skip it because the mode should be edit. See, it skips it. Go into 42 and add the data target. And then go down here. So at this point, we can look at the button again and scroll down. We can see all of the attributes that we added. So here's the type again. It's gonna be somewhere at the bottom. So here's the button. So button type, button, data toggle modal, and then the target is the update employee. So you can see everything looks good. Okay, and you can see the type again here. So I can finish this again, and you can see the edit employee modal comes up, and it's gonna be the same for the delete. Stops here. Go over those lines. It's gonna skip 38 because it's supposed to be delete. Skip this one as well because it's delete. It's gonna come here and then it's gonna execute line 45. Okay, and then it's gonna finish, as you can see here. So everything is working as expected. At least this is like one form of test, I guess, but this is not formal test that you would do for an application. You would probably have some automated tests and then use some fancy library to run in the browser and then click all the buttons for you. But I just wanted to show you that this is actually working and that our logic is good. So I'll see you guys in the next one. What I want to do now is to add functionality to this form right here. So I want that whenever you add in the information for a new employee and you click save changes, I want to make a call to the backend and then save this new employee to the backend and then show the new employee that you added on that list. So I'm going to use Angular form because obviously this is a form. So we need to bring in the forms module. So I'm going to go back to the app, go to the app modules, and then in the import for this, well, I think I already have it here. So that's the forms module. So make sure you have that imported. I don't remember when I added this here, but anyways, you need to add in the forms module here. So let's go back to the template and I need to go to, I'm going to close this for now. So this is the add employee model. So in the form here, I want to give a reference to this form. So I'm going to come here and then do $. I'm just going to call it add form and set it equal to ng form. And that's how you set a reference to a form. You set whatever name you want with the hash in front of it, and then you say this is going to be an ng form. And in here, I need to give it a ng unsubmit so that we can listen to the unsubmit event. So ng submit, and I want to set this equal to a new function that I'm going to create. So I'm going to call it on add employee or something like that. And this is going to take the form. So I'm going to pass in the form that I defined here by that name. So I'm going to copy this and pass it here. So we don't have this function yet. So I'm going to go ahead and create it. So I'm going to go back, go above here, go down, and I'm going to call public, pass the name, and it takes a form. So I'm going to call it the same name. So that's going to be the add form here, and it's going to be of type ng form. So ng form, and it's not going to return anything. So I'm going to pass the return type as void and open and close curly braces. I'll scroll up a little bit. So let's go back here. So for us to be able to turn this form into a form that Angular can understand, we need to have the name attribute. As you can see, for every single one of those input, I have the name here. I'm gonna move this over here so you guys can see it clear. So you have to have this name here because it's going to be used as the key for this input. And all you have to do after that is to just add ng model on those inputs. So I'm going to do ng model, and I'm just going to copy it and put it on every single one of those inputs. For the email, I do the same. For the job title, I do the same. For the font, I'll do the same. And for the image URL, I'm going to do the same. And for the button, so for the first button, I'm not going to do anything. But for the second one, I want to add the disable attribute so that we can disable the button unless the form is valid. So for this, I'm just going to add in the disable attribute. So disable. And I'm just going to set this equal to the form that invalid. So remember, we have a reference to the form here. So I'm gonna pass it down below here, and then I'm gonna check to see if that form is invalid. So if that form is invalid, then this is gonna be true, so this button is gonna be disabled. So we can save all of that and go back to the browser, let it reload, and click to open the form, and you can see the button is disabled. So we know that this is working. So if we put something here, something in every single one of those input, you can, if you watch this button, as soon as I do the last one, it's enabled. Okay, so that's good. So let's go back. Now what I want to do, I want that whenever they click on this button, so make sure the type of this button is submit. That's how you call this ng unsubmit. So this type of this button, it must be submit inside of the form. So now we want to handle this form right here. So whenever they click on this button down below, it's going to call this function, which is on ng unsubmit. So what we want to do is to just take that form, take the value inside of that form, which is going to be in form of a JSON object, and then send it to the backend. So let's go back to the TS file and work on this method. So what I want to do is to just call the employee service. So I'm going to this employee service dot add employee, and then here I'm going to pass in the form. So the add form dot value. So the value on the form is going to be a JSON representation of every single one of those inputs with those names attributes. And I'm going to debug it and show you that in a second. So you remember this is the service making a call to the backend. So we have to subscribe to it so that we can be notified whenever there's something that comes back from the server. So we're going to call subscribe. And inside of that, we're going to wait for a response. So we're going to say if we have a response, which is going to be an employee, then we want to execute some piece of code, open and close curly braces. Otherwise, we're going to do something else. So I'm going to copy the same and then paste it down below. But this time we're looking for an error, and that's going to be of type HTTP error response. So in case it's an error, I want to show an alert. So I'm going to do alert. And I'm going to access the error message. You can see there's a message on the error itself. So that's it for the error handling. Now, there's probably a better way to handle this. So instead of just alerting, you probably will have like some sort of a notification and then you pass the error to it or whatever. But you know, that's not necessary in this case. And then here, what I want to do whenever I got the response, we can log the response so that we can see what it is. So we can do console log and then pass in the response. And then I want to call the get all employees so that I can reload all of the employees, just like that. So I'm going to save it and let's see what's happening. If we have any errors, I'm going to open the terminal again, bring it up. Okay, compile successfully. So this should work actually. So if we click on this form to save all the changes, it should call this function. So there's one last thing I want to do. So you can see that when you click here and you click on save changes, we want this layer to go away. So we have to find a way to click this button right here. So to do this, I'm going to go back and in the template, I'm going to bring this down a little bit. You can see the ID of this button right here. So we can get a hold of that button and then click it. So whenever they click on this function to add a new employee, I'm just going to do document that get element by ID and then pass in the ID of that element, which is a button. So since it's a button, we should have access to the click. So we can call click and then close with semicolon and then save that and let this rebuild. As you can see at the bottom, it's rebuilding. All right, so let's go back. I'm gonna refresh this just to be safe. So now if we click add employee and let's do John, we need the full name, John Doe, test@email.com. I don't know, some UI guy, and pass in some number. And I don't have an image now, so I'm gonna leave this blank. Well, I can't leave it blank, so I'm just gonna say image URL. Okay, so now if I click save changes, You can see it's added, so because we sent it to the backend, and then we have it here. Obviously, we don't have an image for this guy, so I'm just gonna, oh, that's a guy. So I'm gonna copy this image URL. Oops, we can't edit yet. Yeah, we can't do that yet. So we can edit, but we can come back and edit this. So we can't delete, nothing's gonna happen. We can edit, nothing's gonna happen. So we can fix this guy later, but you can see that the add employee is working, and you can check that out if you go to the console. You can see this new object that we get that comes back. That's the new employee that we just added. And you can see that they have this new field that we didn't add, which is the ID. So we know that the add employee is working. Let's go ahead and work on the edit now. So we can open the modal. We just have to preload it with the edit user information, and then we're gonna add an action listener on this button so that we can save or update this user whenever they click on save. So let's go back to the application. And the edit is gonna be very similar to the add. So I'm just gonna go ahead and copy all of this. I'm gonna close this for now, and then go down and paste it. I'm just gonna call it on update employee, and this is gonna take an employee, and that's not gonna be a form, that's gonna be the actual employee. And I don't need to close the modal, so I'm just gonna delete this, because if the user don't want to edit the employee anymore, they can just close it themselves. And then here I'm just gonna pass in the employee, and instead of add employee, I'm just gonna call update employee, and everything else is going to be the same. So now we can use this function in the form in the modal so that we can call this function right here whenever they click on the button. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, go back to the template. So this is the update modal. So I'm just going to collapse it for now. And then I'm going to go into the edit modal, and here's the form. So what I want to happen is I want that when they click this button to save the changes, I want to call this function that I just created. So let's go back here, and in here, I'm just gonna add a click listener on this button. So here, I'm just gonna do click and set it equal to our function. And now we have to pass in the employee here. Okay, so where are we gonna get this employee? So it's gonna be pretty simple. So we're just gonna bind an employee from the template to an employee on the form, or the same employee, but we're just binding it to the employee that we're going to have on the form. And then we can pass that employee whenever they click on the button to open the modal. So let's go up here and let's define this employee here. So we're going to do public. Again, you don't have to define public. If you just don't have any access modifier, it's going to be public by default. So I'm just going to do edit employee, and that's going to be of type employee. So that's going to represent the whatever employee that they're editing. It can be any one of the employees. And then I'm going to take this employee and then go down here. So whenever they click on edit, I want to set this employee, right? So I'm just going to say this dot edit employee, which is the employee in this class, which is what this means, meaning the employee in this class. We're going to set it equal to this employee right here. So whatever employee that we get whenever we're looping, whenever they click on the button to open the modal, we're going to pass that employee here, and then we set it to this employee in this class. So now we can use this employee in this class to bind it to this form right here. I'm just going to go up tab, and then I'm going to give a reference to this form. So I'm going to go in the form tag, and then I'm going to do hash, and I'm just going to call it edit form, and then set it equal to ng form like we did last time. So now we have a reference to this entire form. So we can use that reference in this method and then pass in the value. Remember, the value is a JSON representation of the actual input. So now this is going to be exactly like an actual employee, because we're going to bind every input in this form to the employee that we define up here, this employee right here. So let's go back. I'm just going to copy this. So to do this binding, we're just going to set an ng model equal to this employee for whatever attribute. So here for the name, I'm just going to do ng model and then set that equal to the employee. So double curly braces, and then pass in the employee and the class. Make sure this employee exists, and then we can bind it to the name. So now this input is going to be bind to this employee in the class for this name input here. And we're going to do this for every single one of the attribute on the employee itself. So those two that are hidden on line 102 and 103, that's because I have to place the ID in the employee code, and I don't want to update those. Now, the reason I don't want to update the employee code is because we're just not updating the employee code. We want that when the code is set, that's the employee code for the user forever. But for the ID, the reason we have to pass in the ID because we want to represent the whole object of the actual employee. Otherwise, if we send it without an ID in the backend, or if we didn't have this, it would just do an add. Hibernate would be like, oh, this is a new user because there's no ID, there's no existing ID. So Hibernate will be confusing. We just do an add instead of an update. So we have to pass in this ID here so that Hibernate can know that this is an update and not an add. So right here, we can pass in the ID. And then here, we're going to pass in the employee code. And then here, we're going to pass in the email. Job title. And down here, we're going to pass in the phone. And then here we pass in the image URL. So if you pay close attention to this, you can see that this is just another way of using a form and send value to the backend. And it's pretty much the same thing we're doing here. But the only difference is here we pass in the entire form. But in the add function, we reach out for the value. As you can see here, we get the value, which is the representation, a JSON representation of the actual employee itself. So from the form, if you get the value from that form, it will give you just the input as a name value tag in JSON format. So we're pretty much doing the same thing here. So down here, the difference is we're passing it to this function. We pass in the form and the value, which is represented as an employee because that's what we're doing here for every single one of those inputs, which is why it was important for us to put in the ID and the employee code because we want to represent the whole employee, and then we're hiding those because we don't want the user to update this information, the ID and the employee code, but they will be there in the form itself so that whenever we get the value on this form, it will be represented as the full employee object itself. So just to recap, to understand what's happening here, because this might be a little bit confusing. So if we go into the app component, right? So let me scroll up a little bit. So here we define this edit employee, right? This edit employee is defined in this class, right? And what we're doing is we're binding this edit employee, whatever it is, either if it's empty or whatever the case might be, we're binding it to this form, right? So you can see we do ng model, and then we're binding every attribute on this edit employee to one input on this form, right? And then we give this form a reference here. So with this reference, we can access the value down here, which is going to be a JSON representation of every single one of those input, which is going to be the actual employee. Now, how do we set this employee? Because we have a lot of employee here. So what we do here is every time you click this button, we pass this employee in. So if we go back to the code, whenever they click to edit, we're going to call this function down below on open modal to open the modal. So whenever it's an edit, we're going to say, hey, this employee on this class, which is binding in the form right here, make it the employee that they click on, because you remember there's going to be an iteration for every single one of those employees. So whenever they click on open modal, they're going to pass in the employee for the actual iteration. So this employee will always be set whenever they try to open the edit model. So they open the edit model, this edit employee gets set, and then we're binding this edit employee to the form. So then we have access to this value, which represent a JSON format of that employee, which is the actual employee. So whenever they click on save, then we can pass in this here. And the reason we're adding those two input as hidden, we still have to have them on that form right here, is because we want to show every single one of those attributes on that specific employee. because if we don't, then our object will not be complete. So we have to put in all of the attribute for an employee, which is the ID, code, email, job title, phone, and image URL. So that when we call the ID on this, we can have a full complete object. So now we should be able to test this. So let me go back to the browser. So if I do, I'm just gonna copy this image and see if I can update the image. So if I do edit, as you can see, this user is loaded. So now I can change the image URL, save it, and you can see now it refreshes. So we can also change everything else. So if I pass in the, let's say the email is john@email.com, and let's say they have a new number, some random number, save, you can see it changes right here. So we can debug this a little bit just so you can see what's happening here. So I'm going to go to source. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you can see. And I'm going to go to webpack, the dot folder, the source, and into the app folder. And we want to go into the app component.ts. And I'm going to collapse this back. See if I can zoom in a little bit. So when we click on this edit, right, this method gets called, open modal. And it's going to go into this. And it's going to set this edit employee. So we can check it out. Put a breakpoint here, click on edit, and it stops here. Step over, step over, step over, step over. Now it goes into, it's gonna go into this if statement. You can see now it's gonna set this edit employee as the employee in the current iteration, which is this employee that we click on. So now this edit employee is set, as you can see here, and we can finish this. So now this edit employee modal is up, and we can see we load this user that they click on. How did this happen? It's because we set this employee to the employee that they click on. Now, whenever they click save, we're going to call this an update employee. So now if I click save and we look at this employee, you can see it's a JSON representation or key value. Well, we don't have the curly braces and everything, all the little double quotes, but it's a JSON representation of the employee itself with all of the information. And that's why we have the ID, we have the user code. We don't have them here because they're hidden. These inputs are hidden, but we need to have them so that we can send it to the backend so that the backend is not confused. Say, oh, this is an existing employee because they have an ID. So Hibernate and the backend will understand that and do an update instead of an add. So that's how this whole thing works. Now, that's just one way to do this. You could do the same thing that I did with the add employee. You could pass in the whole form. You can do whatever you want. I'm going to finish this, and you can see, well, I didn't do any changes, but let's say this guy is SQL and UI, and save. Okay, I'm going to remove this breakpoint and finish this. You can see it's updated. So let's go back here. There's a couple things I want to do. So in the app component, what I want to do here is want to clear this form, right? So if I add an employee here, I'm gonna add some random guy here and close this for now and click save. Okay, this guy's added. If I try to add another one, you can see the form is still has the old guy or the old employee that I just added. So I want to clear this, and there's a very handy function that you can call on the form. So let's go back to the app, and here after we loaded all the employee, we can clear the form. So we can call the form and then call a method on it, and this method is reset. So we're gonna do that, and we're gonna do that either if it's successful or not successful so that we can clear the form. So let's let that rebuild. So now if we add someone again, some random guy, save, click on the form again, you can see now it's empty. So the last thing we have to do is to work on this delete. So as you can see, we can have the modal come up. We just have to put an event listener on that yes, and then confirm the deletion of this employee. So we're going to do that in the next lecture. Now we need to be able to delete an employee. So whenever they click the X here and they click yes, then we want the employee to be deleted. Obviously, this is not working because we haven't added the functionality for that. So let's go back into the app, and I don't remember how the delete works. So let's go back to the service. So here's the delete. So we need the employee ID. which is gonna be a number. So let's go back here. What we can do, I'm just gonna go down here and then copy this again and then paste it down. And I'm gonna change this to on delete employee. So we're gonna take the employee ID, and that's gonna be a number. The return type is still void, and here we're gonna call the delete employee from the service and pass in the employee ID. And we get an error here, and I think it's because this doesn't return anything except the HTTP status code. So let's go back to the service. Yep, so this doesn't return anything, so it returns void. So we can go back here and say whatever the response is going to be, it's going to be of type void, and we don't need to log this. Well, actually we can still log it so that we can see what it is. And then we're going to call the get employees again to reload everything, and then we will show the error message if there's an error. And I think that's pretty much everything we have to do. Now we're gonna do something similar that we did last time. So whenever it's an edit, we're gonna define a new variable. So this delete employee, and we're gonna set it equal to the employee that's being passed into this function. And we need to define this at the class, quick fix, declare property. Let's scroll up to see what this did for us. So I'm just gonna put the qualifier on that. So I'm just gonna make it public. So this is gonna represent the delete employee, and then we can use that employee as the employee in the template because it's declared at the class level. So scroll down, make sure I put this in the right spot. So okay, when it's delete, then we set the delete employee to the employee that's being passed in here, just like we did with the edit employee. So now we can use this to bind it in the template. So I'm just gonna copy it, go back to the template, and I'm gonna collapse the edit modal, go to the delete one, and we can bind it to this button here whenever they click yes. So we can add a click listener and set it equal to our function, which is delete employee. And we're gonna pass in the delete employee. So we're gonna do delete employee, which is coming from the component, and we pass in the ID because that's all we need to call this function. And we're gonna put the safe navigator here, and we can also add the name of the employee. So we're gonna say, are you sure you really want to delete employee so and so? So we can pass in the employee name here. So that's gonna be the delete employee. And we want the name, so that way we can personify this this message. Let's go up a little bit. I think we can do the same for this. So edit employee, and then we pass in the edit employee name. So we can copy this and paste it here, so that they know what employee they're deleting. So I'm gonna collapse this back. So that should work. So whenever they click to, and they say yes, then it's gonna call this function, and then it's gonna pass in the ID of this employee. So let's go back to the app, make sure we don't have any errors. Inspect console. Okay, it's just trying to look these images that we don't have, like this image in here and here. So if we refresh it, that's what it's gonna say. You can see you can't find those images because we didn't put any images for this. Let's close this and let's delete. Yes, you can see it's gone. So let's debug this to make sure it's working properly. So again, I'm gonna go to source, and let's go to the open modal, line 75, put a breakpoint, and I'm gonna delete this user. So it's gonna come here, and you can see it's the actual user that we're trying to delete, and it's gonna go in. And it's supposed to go into this. So let's see. Yep, goes into this. So it's gonna set this delete employee here. So step over, look at the delete employee. It's this employee here. So we can finish this. So this modal is gonna come up. So on that form, we have this employee here. As you can see, his name appears here. Okay, so we can say yes. So I'm gonna put another breakpoint before I do that. So I'm gonna put in 63 here so we can see what's happening here. So if I do yes and check this ID, it's ID 9, which is the ID of the employee, and it's gonna make the call to the backend. So we can finish this. you can see the employee is removed. So that's pretty much everything for this little tiny application. Now we have to just work on this search employee so that whenever we start typing something here, and then we can filter this list right here. And then we'll also have to fix this. Actually, this is a quick fix. Let's see if I can just fix it real quick. So we want to show this in case there is no employee. Obviously, we don't want to show this and then some employee here, or even one employee, because we have at least one. So we need to put a condition on this alert so that we can only show this alert when we have 0 employee here. And that's super easy to do. So let's go back to the app, and this is the notification. So from line 153. So what we have to do is to just put a condition on this. So we can do this by adding an ngIf. So I'm going to do ngIf. So what I want to check is the length of the array. So remember, we have the list of all the employees on this variable here, which is an array, as you can see here, or a list from a Java, or collection from a Java perspective. So we can just check the length of this list and then use that as our condition. So we can go back here. We're going to say, if this list exists, see if you can get the length on that list. Okay. And we can say, if this length is 0, then show this list. Okay. Oh, show this notification. So it's going to check to see if this is true. If it's not true, then it's not going to show this alert. If it is, then it will show this alert, which means we have 0 employees. So if we save this, go back, you can see now it's gone because we have that condition. Before I start working on this search here, I want to show you the function that I'm going to be using. It's the indexOf function that you can use on array in JavaScript. So if you have an array in JavaScript, you can use this function to find the first index of an element if the element exists. Otherwise, it's going to be -1 if the element doesn't exist. So we can use a reverse check on this -1 so that we can find out if an element actually exists on an array. So it's a smart thing to do, but it's very efficient because this indexOf method is pretty fast. So let's go back to the application, and let's close this for now. I'm just gonna go into the component, and right before this function, I'm gonna create another function, and I'm just gonna call it search employee. So search employees may be better, and it's gonna take a key, and that's gonna be a string. Okay, so again, it's not gonna return anything, so I'm gonna pass in void as the return type, and then do open and close curly braces. So what I want to do is to define a new array where I can store all of the employees that match the actual key. So to do this, I'm just going to create a constant, and I'm just going to call it results, which is the result of all the employee. And I'm going to set it equal to, well, I have to give it a type first since we're using TypeScript. So that's going to be of type employee array. And I'm going to initialize it as an empty array, just like that. Oops, semicolon. So now we can use this constant to store all of the employees that match this key here, or either their name or their email matches the actual key or something else. So here, I'm just going to create a loop. So I'm going to do for every employee. Well, I have to define this first. So constant employee of the employee list. So this employees. So we're going to loop over all of the employees that we have in the actual application. So this employees here is this employees array that we define up here. So that holds all of the employees on the page. So we're going to loop through all of them. So let's go down, and we're going to come back here. Okay, so we define this temporary variable or this local variable here to hold all of the employees whose name or email or job title match this key here. And then we're gonna, if they do match the key, then we're gonna put them in this result here so that we can filter the list. So what I want to do now, I want to do my check. So I want to do if for that employee that I have here. Okay, I'm gonna put their name in lowercase. So I'm gonna do that employee name, and I want this to be to lowercase. Okay, because I want everything to be lowercase. And then I want to say if the index of this key exist inside of it. So I'm going to do key and then do two lowercase as well, so that they can both be in the same case, just like that. And then I check to see if this is not equal -1, which means we found it. So -1. So that's gonna be the check. And I'm gonna go over this in just a second. So in that case, what we want to do, we want to add that employee into this list. So we can call results, and we can just push. And we're gonna push the employee in the current iteration, which is this employee right here. Okay, so we need to close this and then remove this extra parenthesis. So just to understand what this is doing, right? So we're gonna iterate or loop over all of the employees, right? All of them. And then we're gonna see for every single one of them. So this constant employee here, we're gonna say check for the name. We're gonna turn that name into lowercase or uppercase, it doesn't matter. And we're gonna do index of the key, which is whatever the user passed in when they're searching in the search box. Turn that to lowercase as well in case the user put uppercase. And then we're gonna check to see if that doesn't equal -1. So remember, if it equals -1, that means it's not present. So if we check for not equal -1, that means it's present for the index of, if you remember. So that's gonna put that employee into this list. And then we can just do this for everything else. So we can do it for the email or whatever else. So I'm gonna copy this, go on a new line and do an OR, and then paste that. And I'm gonna go on a new line again and do an OR, paste it again. And here we can check for the email. So if it matches the email, the phone, and I think we need to do it one more time. So I'm gonna do another OR, pass it again, and do the actual job title. Okay, so that way we check this key against the name, the email, the phone, the job title, and then we put it into this new array right here. So after we loop right here from line 76, we can set that list of employees to this result, because then that's represent our new list here. So that will work for every time they search. So every time they search, it would work. But the only problem is we need to have a way to reset this in case they put in a key and the key doesn't match nothing on this check here. So it doesn't match the name, the email, or phone number, or title of any of those employees here. So the way I'm gonna do this is to check to see if I have anything in result. So I can do if result that length and make sure if it's 0, or if I don't have a key. So if key is not truthy, so that means they didn't enter anything, it's empty. So in that case, then I can just call the method to get all the employees again. And by calling this method, it's gonna reset this employee to the employees from the backend. So now we can save all of that. So I just have to use this function on some listener on this inbox here. So let's go back to the app and let's go back to the template. Gonna scroll up. So this is the form, right? So here's the input for the search, right? So what we can do here, we can add our function. So actually, let me do it after the type. So I can come here and then I can do, so that's not going to be a click because we need to listen every time that they type something in. So in that case, we need to use ng model change. Okay, so this is going to fire whatever function you set it equal to every time the input change. And then we can pass in the employee here. And then here we can pass in some key value. So you can say value. So then now we have to set this key. So I'm going to put this on a new line. So we don't have this key, right? But we have this input. So we can give this input some local reference. So I'm going to do #, and that's going to be key because that's the name that we set here. And I'm just going to set this equal to ng model. Okay, so now we have this local reference on this form. And of course, we have to pass in this ng model on the form itself. And we have a name, which is key, and we have ng model, and then we pass it in here. So instead of using the form here, we could use the form here and then put it on the form and then call this function. but we're just doing it on the input itself, because you can also put a reference on the input itself, and then you can access the same value on that input. So if we save all of this and go back, I'm gonna refresh this just to be safe. So if I do Daniel, you can see it's refreshing. And let's see if I can do some console log for this so you can see what's happening. So if I check this key here, I can just do console.log and then pass in the key. So whatever key that they pass in, which is whatever input they put in the input form, and save it, let it reload, and let's inspect that. Let's go to the console, clear this, and now, oops, it's still loading. So if I do D, you can see it's typed DA Daniel. You can see it's filtering. So that's how this works. But there's another way we could do this. We could actually have this in the backend and then, you know, filter it in the backend and then call it in the backend and then get the response. But that's just an extra load on our server, and doing it this way is a lot easier. So that's pretty much everything. Obviously, there's a lot going on here, and I would probably need to take a little bit more time to explain like what all of these things is doing. But again, I'm assuming you're a little bit familiar with Angular. This app is very minimal, so there's not really a lot going on here. Well, maybe, but in reality, if you look at actual, you know, enterprise application and things like that, there's not really a lot going on here. We just have a few functionalities. We can add, you know, edit and then delete and then search. So those are pretty simple standard functionality. And I just wanted to give you guys an idea of how you can build a simple little application, but then you try to stick to best practice and do things the right way. So I hope you enjoyed this, and all of the code is in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
I hope you made this far, and as you saw throughout this course, you have learned quite a lot, to be honest. And if you want to further increase your knowledge on Spring Boot and Angular, go ahead and check the link in the description of this video, where Junior has a complete course teaching you everything you need to know to master Spring Boot and AngularJS. This is all from me. I'm gonna let Junior wrap things up, and I'll catch you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum.